My name is Callan Rourke, and the last time I held a wrench for a living, I was 31 years old, 6 centuries from now, in a world that had already forgotten what a forge looked like. I died there, running calculations on a railgun coil. I woke up here, in a body that was also 31, holding a hammer I didn't know how to use, in front of 7 judges who had already decided I was worthless. The Ordvale trial yard smells like coal smoke and wet stone, even in memory. Stone risers on 3 sides, packed with apprentices who came to watch someone fail, and at the center, a raised forge platform where you either walk away licensed or walk away branded. I had failed there 6 times already. This was attempt number 7. Grandmaster Valder Kresh, 58, Supreme Arbiter of the Blade Accord, and the only man in the Empire with the legal authority to certify a smith, stood at the platform's edge with his arms folded. He didn't look angry, he looked bored, which was worse. Boredom meant he'd already written the verdict before I lifted the hammer. The trial itself is simple on paper. Take raw ore, take a bloodline-approved pattern, produce a blade that meets Accord spec within 2 hours. I can build an engine from scrap. I cannot, it turns out, make my hands move the way 600 years of muscle memory insist they should not. My 7th blade came out warped at the tang, the edge geometry closer to a crowbar than a sword. A boy 2 stations down, 16 and gifted, finished his in 90 minutes and got applause. I got silence, and then I got Kresh's voice carrying across the whole yard. 7 attempts, he said, and 7 failures to produce anything resembling a weapon with a lineage. He picked up my blade between 2 fingers like it might infect him. This isn't incompetence. Incompetence I could forgive. This is something else entirely. He turned to the scribe beside him and dictated my status without once looking back at me. Aberration. That's the word they used, and it isn't an insult in Ordvale. It's a legal classification, the kind that gets stamped into a ledger and follows you past any city gate you try to walk through afterward. A weapon without a bloodline is not a weapon, Kresh told the yard, though he was really telling me it is a crime looking for an excuse, and I will not certify a man who cannot tell the difference. The 16-year-old who'd finished 90 minutes ahead of me, a boy named Nothing I Ever Learned, because nobody introduces you to the winner when you're the lesson, glanced back once on his way off the platform, not cruelty in his face, just the particular discomfort of watching a verdict land on someone else, and knowing it could just as easily have been him. I'd spent 6 failed attempts, telling myself the 7th would be different, the way any engineer tells himself the next test run will finally isolate the variable that's been failing. It wasn't stubbornness exactly, it was the specific, stupid optimism of a man who'd spent an entire previous career solving problems other people had declared unsolvable, and hadn't yet learned that this particular problem wasn't an engineering problem at all. The guards who escorted me out weren't rough about it, which somehow made it worse. Routine humiliation, filed and processed. They gave me a receipt for the tools I'd been renting, deducted their value from what little I had, and dropped 2 copper coins into my palm, as if returning change after a transaction I'd never agreed to. 2 coins. That was the sum of 31 years, in this life and the one before it, converted into local currency and handed back to me by a guard who wouldn't meet my eyes. I've priced out worse days. I have never priced out a worse hour. Nobody in the trial yard offered me a word of sympathy on the way out, which I understood even then wasn't cruelty so much as self-preservation. Sympathy for an aberration carries its own risk under a charter that treated the classification as contagious by association, and I couldn't blame anyone there for keeping their distance from a man the Grandmaster himself had just publicly condemned. The formal notice came with the coins, stamped and everything, because Ordvale does love its paperwork, even when it's destroying you. 24 hours to leave the capital or be arrested as an unlicensed vagrant carrying contraband tools. My hammer, apparently, counted as contraband once I stopped being a person allowed to hold it professionally. I walked out through the lower district that afternoon, doing the kind of math you do when you're trying not to think about the actual problem. 2 coins bought half a loaf of bread and nothing else. 24 hours is not enough time to build a life. It is, I would learn, exactly enough time to notice something. It happened in a rented room I couldn't really afford for one more night, staring at the crooked blade I'd been allowed to keep since it was legally worthless. A pale rectangle unfolded in the air in front of me, uninvited, and for a moment I thought the exhaustion had finally cracked something in my skull. Forge system detected. Rank F. Experience 0/100. Available schematics. Basic tools. Raw stock preparation. Cooldown after forging 6 hours. I read it 4 times before I believed it wasn't a hallucination brought on by hunger. 6 centuries of engineering training does something specific to a person's skepticism, and that something is not immediately trust the floating text. But the panel didn't flicker, didn't fade, and when I reached toward it, my finger passed through nothing at all, which is exactly what a genuine interface should do. There was a strange comfort in the panel's indifference to my history. I realized somewhere in that rented room, the same comfort I used to find in a well-specified engineering brief. It didn't care that I'd once designed weapons for a civilization that no longer existed. It didn't care that I'd failed the trial 7 times. It only cared what I forged next, measured against rules it would enforce identically, no matter who stood in front of it. I want to be precise about what this was and wasn't, because precision is the only thing I actually still had. It wasn't power. It wasn't a shortcut past the 7 failures I just racked up in front of an audience. It was a rank, a number, and a locked door to schematics I hadn't earned the right to open yet. Rank F meant I could requisition raw stock and basic tools, nothing more, and even that access came with the same 6-hour cooldown for anything I actually forged, a mandatory cooling period the panel described as physical, not decorative. Force it early, it warned, and the metal cracks along the grain. I'd spend the next 2 years learning exactly how literal that warning was. There was a second detail buried in the panel that I almost missed reading it too fast. Schematics unlock with rank, craftsmanship does not. The system would hand me the blueprint for a thing. It would never hand me the hands to build it well. That gap sat there like a debt with no due date, and it would matter more than anything else about this whole system before the end. I tested the panel's honesty the only way an engineer knows how, by trying to break it. I asked it for a schematic 2 ranks above where I stood, and it simply declined, flat and mechanical, no negotiation available. I asked it to skip the cooldown on a tool I hadn't even forged yet, and it declined that too, apparently uninterested in hypotheticals. Whatever had put this thing in my head, it wasn't going to be talked out of its own rules, and something about that rigidity was, strangely, the first reassuring fact I'd encountered all day. I didn't have the luxury of studying it further. 24 hours doesn't pause for a man staring at a status screen, and Ordvale's gate guards check papers at dawn, whether or not you've had a religious experience overnight. I packed the 1 bag I owned, the crooked blade, my 2 coins, and left before the sun was fully up. I stopped once, halfway across the lower district, at a public notice board where a fresh bulletin listed the week's certified smiths and their assigned garrison contracts, each name worth more coin in a season than I'd see in a year, even if I somehow found honest work. I didn't linger on it. Envy is an expensive habit for a man with 2 coins and a deadline. The capital's outer road splits 3 ways past the last checkpoint. One route runs toward the farming provinces, well patrolled, well taxed, no place for a man with an aberration stamp on his papers. Another curls south toward the mountain holds, too far to reach on foot with what I had. The third heads east, toward a stretch of borderland the maps simply mark as unclaimed. The guard at the eastern checkpoint barely glanced at my papers before waving me through with the particular contempt reserved for people who are about to become someone else's problem. Ashfell Reach, he said, jerking his thumb east. Nobody patrols out there. Nobody wants to. He said it like a warning. I heard it like the first honest piece of good news I'd gotten in 2 lifetimes. I walked for 6 hours before the road stopped pretending to be a road, degrading into a rutted track through scrubgrass and gray stone that the Empire had apparently decided wasn't worth the ink to survey properly. No border markers, no toll posts, no evidence that Ordvale's Accord extended out here at all, which was, on reflection, the entire point of the place existing. Somewhere around the 2nd hour of walking, I tried the panel again, mostly out of boredom, and found I could requisition a fistful of scrap iron from nowhere I could identify, the way a game might spawn starting inventory. I turned it over in my hands. It was ordinary metal. It just happened to arrive for free, which in my current financial situation felt like the single most impressive thing that had ever occurred. I forged nothing that first day. Rank F schematics were tools, hooks, a crude trowel, nothing that would survive contact with the kind of trouble I expected to find in unpatrolled borderland. I wanted to see what a completed cycle actually looked like before I bet anything on it. So I built a simple flat blade for cutting rope, watched the 6-hour cooldown countdown appear, and hold steady, and slept badly beside a fire I'd built myself for the first time in either life. I cataloged everything that night out of pure habit, the way I'd once cataloged test data from a failed prototype run, because habits built over 6 centuries don't dissolve just because the century itself has. Fire radius, fuel consumption per hour, the specific angle at which the wind came down off the ridge and threatened to scatter sparks toward the dry grass. None of it was useful to anyone but me. All of it made the unfamiliar feel, briefly, like something I could actually manage. By morning, the cooldown had cleared, and the rope cutter sat cool and solid in my bag, bag, unremarkable in every way except that I had made it, badly, with my own 2 hands, and a system that refused to do the hard part for me. Somewhere behind me, Ordvale's smiths were finishing their morning inspections, in a trial yard that had already forgotten my name. I didn't know yet what Ashfell Reach actually contained. I didn't know about the 40 people already surviving out there on nothing, or the woman holding them together through sheer stubbornness, or the kind of trouble that finds anyone stupid enough to build something worth taking. I only knew that Kresh's verdict had followed me exactly as far as the last checkpoint, and not one step further. 2 coins, 24 hours, and a system that measured my worth in experience points instead of bloodline. It wasn't much of a start, but I'd built empires out of less elegant materials than that, back when empires meant something else entirely, and I intended to see exactly how far a rank F forge could carry a man with nothing left to lose. 3 days of walking brought me to a valley I wouldn't have looked at twice in my old life, a shallow basin of gray scrub and cracked stone that the Empire's surveyors had apparently decided wasn't worth the parchment. Smoke rose from behind a ridge on the far side, thin and careful, the kind of fire someone builds when they don't want to be found. I approached slow, hands visible, because a stranger with a bag of scrap iron and no papers is exactly the kind of thing that gets shot at first and questioned never in a place with no law to answer to. What I found behind the ridge was 40 people living inside a windbreak of stacked stone and salvaged canvas, thinner than they should have been, watching me the way you watch weather. Sanavoy stepped forward before anyone else moved. 51 years old, gray hair cropped short for practicality rather than fashion, carrying herself like someone who'd buried the argument about who was in charge a long time ago because nobody else wanted the job. "You've got an Ordvale cut to your boots," she said. "That's either bad luck for you or bad luck for us. Which is it?" I told her the truth, mostly because I'd already learned that lying costs more than it saves when everyone around you has nothing left to lose. 7 failed trials, an aberration brand, 2 coins. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished she asked the only question that actually mattered to her. "Can you make anything that keeps my people alive through the next storm season?" I didn't know yet. That was the honest answer, and I gave it to her, along with the panel I could now summon at will and the 6-hour cooldown that came attached to it like a leash. She didn't understand the mechanics, not really, but she understood scarcity better than anyone I'd ever met, and scarcity was a language we both spoke fluently. A boy of about 9, thin enough that I cataloged it automatically the way I once cataloged stress fractures, spent that first afternoon watching me from behind a stacked stone wall rather than approaching directly. Sana caught me noticing him, losing count of how many places that one's been, she said. "Don't make promises to him. Make results instead, if you've got any in you." 40 people, I learned over the next 2 days, had washed out here from 6 different failed settlements. Each one collapsed by drought, by raiders, by the simple math of not enough food for too many mouths. Ashfell Reach wasn't a place anyone chose. It was the last unclaimed patch of dirt the Empire hadn't bothered to want, which made it the one place nobody would come looking for people like us. I spent an evening with Sana going over what the camp actually knew about the Empire's habits out here, information that mattered as much as any schematic. Patrols hadn't come within a day's ride of the valley in 3 years, she said, not because Ordvale respected the border, but because the terrain made a punitive raid expensive relative to whatever it might recover. That calculus, she warned, could change the moment anyone out here looked worth the expense. The system panel, when I had time to actually study it, turned out to be more rulebook than gift. Rank F sat capped at basic tools and raw stock, and the moment I tried to requisition anything beyond that spec, the interface simply refused. Cold and mechanical, the way a vending machine refuses a coin it doesn't recognize. Experience accrued per completed forge, scaled to complexity, and nothing about that curve rewarded impatience. The cooldown was the part that reshaped how I thought about the whole system. 6 hours at rank F, the panel confirmed again when I pushed it, and it wasn't a suggestion. I tried forcing a second tool through early, on my 3rd day in the valley, and the blade came out of the fire with a hairline crack running the whole spine. Useless. The metal itself apparently keeping better track of the rules than I was. There was a second wall behind the first one, and it worried me more than any cooldown timer. The system would happily hand me a schematic for something complex the moment my rank cleared the threshold. It would never once tell me how to actually shape the metal well. 2 attempts at a proper hinge came out lopsided and weak, technically matching the blueprint, practically useless, because knowing the shape of a thing and knowing how to make it are different disciplines entirely. 2 more hinges failed the same way before I finally understood what the panel would never tell me directly, that a schematic describes geometry, not motion. And motion was the entire missing half of the craft. I'd spent 6 centuries designing things other hands built. My own hands, it turned out, had never once had to learn what they were now being asked to do. Sana watched me fail at the hinge with the patience of someone who'd already priced my usefulness at 0 and was waiting to be proven wrong. "You've got the recipe," she said, turning the crooked piece over in her hands, and none of the hands. It wasn't cruel. It was just accurate, and accuracy was the only currency that mattered out here. I spent that week doing inventory instead of forging, because a man who doesn't know his resources is a man who's about to waste them. Asheville's 40 people own 9 working tools between them, 1 working well, and enough grain for maybe 11 more days if nobody new showed up hungry. Every number I collected went into a mental ledger I hadn't kept since my last life, and it felt, unreasonably, like coming home. The camp's 9 working tools each had a name by the time I finished my inventory, given by whoever had carried them longest, and I understood before Sana explained it directly that naming a tool out here wasn't sentiment, it was tracking. The same instinct that made her log every arrival by hand applied to the few objects that had survived as many failed settlements as the people carrying them had. On the 8th day, I forged something that wasn't on any schematic list at all, which the panel allowed without comment. A small iron hook meant to reinforce the canvas windbreak against the wind that came screaming down the valley every evening. It wasn't clever. It wasn't rank advancing in any meaningful way. It held though, and holding was the entire specification. I mapped the whole valley on a scrap of hide. During a rare quiet afternoon, stream, ridge, the 8 defensible approaches worth naming, the 3 that weren't, more out of old habit than any immediate need. Sana studied the finished map longer than I expected her to. "Nobody's ever bothered drawing this place before," she said. "Didn't seem worth the ink when we thought we'd be moving on again within the season." Rank-E arrived 2 days after that, the panel chiming its update while I was hauling water. Experience 100 over 100, dissolving into a fresh bar and a fresh cap. Rank-E, new schematics, reinforced tools, simple mechanisms. I stood there in the wind reading it twice, the way I'd read the very first panel twice, except this time, it wasn't disbelief. It was the specific satisfaction of watching a system respond exactly the way a well-built system should. Simple mechanisms meant hinges, latches, the crude beginnings of anything with moving parts, and it meant something else too, something I didn't say out loud to Sana or anyone else yet because I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Somewhere in that widening category sat the schematic fragments of a mechanism I recognized from 6 centuries and 1 entire civilization away. A firing pin, a hammer, a trigger. I'd built weapons for a living once, in the sense that I'd designed the coil housings that made older weapons obsolete, and the muscle memory for that kind of geometry sat in me completely differently than the muscle memory for swordsmithing never had. My hands didn't fumble reaching for it. For the first time since waking up in this body, something about the forge felt like mine instead of borrowed. I didn't tell Sana what I was building, not because I distrusted her, but because a half-finished idea announced too early tends to collect doubt faster than it collects patience. And doubt was a resource the camp couldn't spare either. I told her only that I needed 3 more days, and whatever scrap the camp could part with, and she gave me both, without asking the question I could see sitting behind her eyes. The valley taught me its own arithmetic that week, separate from the system's. 40 people needed roughly 600 calories a day more than they were getting. The stream at the valley's north end ran clean, but shallow, enough for drinking, not enough for a second growing season. Without work I didn't yet have rank to do. None of it was written on any panel. All of it mattered exactly as much as experience points did. I tested the 6-hour cooldown's honesty a second time deliberately, forging 2 simple hooks back to back and timing the weight between them against nothing but patience and the fire's own dying light. And the panel held its number exactly, to the minute, in a way that told me whatever governed this system respected consistency the same way good engineering always had. By the 11th day in Asheville Reach, I had a working prototype sitting in front of me that looked less like a weapon and more like an argument in metal. A single barrel, a crude flint striker, adapted from a schematic meant for lighting forge coals. A stock shaped by hands still relearning what precision felt like. It misfired twice in testing. On the 3rd try, it put a scrap iron ball clean through a fence post from 20 paces. I hadn't shown it to anyone yet, and I had no idea it was about to matter within the week. Not as a curiosity, but as the only thing standing between an old man I'd never met and a patrol of Ordvale knights who had no reason to know that the Empire's laws stopped meaning anything the moment you crossed crossed into unclaimed ground. The knights came through the eastern scrub on the 12th day, 3 of them on horseback, chasing a lone man on foot who'd clearly been running longer than anybody could sustain. I saw the pursuit from the ridge before Sana's lookouts did, close enough to make out the Ordvale crest on the lead rider's shoulder, far enough that I had maybe 90 seconds to decide what kind of man I intended to be out here. The old rules said don't get involved, because unclaimed ground only stays unclaimed if nobody gives the Empire a reason to remember it exists. The prototype in my bag said something else entirely, and I'd already spent 11 days building an argument I hadn't tested past a fence post. 90 seconds isn't much time to weigh a moral question against a piece of untested engineering. I went with the engineering. The running man went down hard about 40 paces from where I stood, exhaustion finally winning the fight his legs had been losing for a while, and the lead knight slowed his horse to a walk, unhurried, the particular unhurried of someone who has never once lost a chase and doesn't expect this to be the exception. I stepped out from the scrub with the pistol raised, and no plan beyond the next 5 seconds. Ordvale business, the knight said, not even looking at me directly. The way you'd address a fence you expected to just move. Step aside. This man's under a heresy warrant. I didn't step aside. I aimed at the ground 8 feet in front of his horse and pulled the trigger, and the crack that followed was louder than anything this valley had heard and longer than any of these 40 refugees had been alive. The shot kicked up dirt and stone in a spray that made the horse rear hard enough to nearly throw its rider, and all 3 knights froze in the particular stillness of men who have just watched physics do something their training never prepared them for. No blade had moved. No spell had been cast that any of them recognized. I'd broken a rule they didn't know existed to break. Next one isn't aimed at dirt, I said, which was a lie, because the cooldown on the pistol's components meant I had exactly 1 more shot in me before the barrel needed hours to cool, and I was betting my life and this stranger's on 3 armored men not calling that bluff. They didn't call it. Whatever they'd just watched happen looked enough like sorcery that none of them wanted to be the one who tested its limits. They rode off north, slower than they'd arrived, throwing glances back that told me this wasn't over so much as postponed, and I turned to find the man they'd been chasing sitting up in the dirt, staring at the pistol in my hand like it had personally rearranged his understanding of the world. He was old, 62 by the lines on his face, and the gray shot through what was left of his hair. And his hands, when I helped him up, were a smith's hands, scarred and burned in a pattern I recognized immediately because I'd built a version of my own over the last 11 days. Relic doll, he said, once he'd caught enough breath to manage it, and I've been making weapons in this empire for 40 years, and I have never seen anything do what that thing you're holding just did. He asked to hold it before he asked my name, which told me most of what I needed to know about the kind of man he was. I gave it to him. He turned it over with the specific reverence of a craftsman recognizing a problem he'd never thought to solve, testing the weight, sighting down the barrel, running one scarred thumb along the crude striker mechanism with the focus of someone reading a language he was fluent in but had never seen written down this way. This shouldn't work, he said finally. The tolerances are wrong, and it worked anyway. He explained his own situation over the fire that night, once Sana had folded him into the camp with the same wary hospitality she'd shown me. Relic had spent 4 decades as a licensed smith before the Blade Accords inspectors found him working unblessed alloy, metal not drawn from the sanctioned quarries, purchased instead from traders outside the Accords' reach because the sanctioned stock had gone thin and his customers still needed tools that worked. Heresy, technically, under a law written to protect a monopoly rather than a doctrine. Kresh's people don't care about the doctrine, he said, and the name landed in my chest like a struck anvil because I hadn't told anyone here about the man who'd branded me an aberration, and I hadn't expected to hear his name again this soon. They care about who controls the contracts. I stopped being useful to that arrangement, so I became a criminal instead. Efficient system, if you're the one who wrote it. I told him my own story then, the trial, the 7 failures, the brand, and watched his expression shift from polite interest into something sharper as I described the crooked blades I couldn't stop producing. You've got hands that don't know sword work, he said slowly, and a mind that clearly knows something else entirely. That pistol isn't luck. That's a different craft wearing a smith's coat. What he offered me that night wasn't charity. It was a trade, plainly stated, the kind I understood instinctively from a life spent structuring exactly this sort of arrangement. He'd teach me technique, the actual handcraft, the system schematics couldn't provide, the difference between a design that worked on paper and a design that survived being fired twice in a row. In exchange, he wanted a hand in building whatever I was building and a permanent distance between himself and Ordvale's warrant. The system gives me the shape, I told him, laying it out the way I'd lay out a contract, and gives me a rank ceiling on what shapes I'm even allowed to attempt. It doesn't give me the hands. You've got 40 years of hands and nowhere left to use them. I've got a design nobody in this empire has ever seen, and a settlement that's going to need defending a lot sooner than any of us would like. He didn't ask what I'd been before this life, whatever strange truth lay behind a man who thought in mechanisms no local smith recognized, and I didn't volunteer at that first night. Some explanations take longer to earn trust than a single fireside conversation can buy, and Relic, I was learning, respected an unexplained gap in a story far more than he'd have respected a convenient lie filling it. Renic's laugh was dry and short, more agreement than amusement. Kresh built an entire empire's law around the idea that a weapon needs a bloodline, he said. Neither of us has one he'd recognize. Seems like exactly the kind of problem two men with nothing left to lose should try solving together. He held out his scarred hand, and I shook it, and that was the whole ceremony. He started that first morning, not at the anvil, but with an empty hand, making me repeat the swing motion 40 times before he'd let me near hot metal at all. Ordvale trains for 6 years before an apprentice touches a live forge unsupervised, he said, watching my form with open skepticism. You've had 11 days in a system panel. We're going to disagree about the schedule, and I'm going to win that argument every time. We started the next morning before the sun was properly up. Relic correcting the angle of my hammer strikes with the patient brutality of a man who'd trained apprentices before and had no patience left for coddling one. He taught by comparison more than by instruction, holding my crooked early pieces beside his own decades-old work, and making me describe the difference out loud before he'd corrected himself. Naming the flaws half the repair, he said. The other half is just patience, which I notice you have more of than most men your age, whatever age that actually is. My first supervised piece under his eye came out straighter than anything I'd made alone in 11 days. Not because the system had changed, but because I finally understood what my hands were supposed to be doing while the panel handled the blueprint. By the end of that first lesson, the panel updated quietly in the corner of my vision, a small note I hadn't seen it produce before. Technique modifier detected, mentored craftsmanship, quality output increased. The system, it turned out, had been waiting the whole time for exactly this, tracking a variable I'd had no way to fill on my own, and Relic Doll had just become the missing half of an equation I hadn't known was incomplete. Relic asked me, somewhere in that first week of lessons, why a man who could apparently summon raw iron from nothing still bothered learning to swing a hammer correctly at all. I told him the honest answer, which was that the system had never once offered to do the actual work for me, only the ingredients and the instructions, and that the difference between those two things had turned out to be the whole craft. He seemed satisfied with that answer, in a way he wasn't satisfied with most things I said. Santa found me that evening cleaning the pistol by firelight, Relic already asleep against a supply crate, after a day that had aged him 20 years and taken 10 of them back. 40 people, she said, sitting down across from me. And now 41. And now the Empire knows exactly where its border stops meaning anything. You bought us a fight, Kellen Rourke. I hope you bought us the tools to win it too. Relic packed his tools that same night into the same worn satchel he'd been carrying when the knights caught up to him. Not to leave, but out of the specific habit of a man who'd learned the hard way never to assume tomorrow would look like today. I found the gesture more reassuring than unsettling. It meant he was planning to stay long enough to need the habit at all. I didn't have an answer that felt honest yet, not one built on anything sturdier than 11 days of forging and a single working prototype. What I had instead was a rank that would keep climbing, a teacher who understood the parts of the craft no system panel could hand me, and a settlement of 41 people who just watched a stranger break a law none of them had ever had the luxury of testing. It would have to be enough for now. Word travels strangely across unclaimed ground, slower than a road but somehow more thoroughly, passed hand to hand by traders and drifters who have nothing to sell but news. Within 6 weeks of the knights riding off empty-handed, Ashfell Reach had a name people used, and a name people used is a name that eventually reaches someone looking for something worth stealing. The camp had grown by then to 60-some souls, refugees drifting in from failed settlements further south, drawn by rumors of a working forge in a valley nobody official seemed to be patrolling. Rank had climbed with the practice. D now, experience, resetting each threshold into a fresh climb. Schematics unlocking access to reinforced barrels and simple firing assemblies that Relic and I refined by hand every single evening. Brunhall arrived on a gray morning with 19 men behind him, not refugees, mercenaries, the kind of outfit that survives on unclaimed ground by taking what settlements can't afford to defend. He was 44, built like a doorframe, with a scar through one eyebrow that pulled his whole expression into a permanent question mark. And he didn't bother with threats before his men fanned out along the ridge above the camp. Simple arithmetic, he called down, loud enough for the whole valley to hear. You've got food, tools, and no wall. I've got 19 men who eat regular and fight for coin. You pay a toll, or I take double that in whatever I can carry. It was, I had to admit even in the moment, an honest pitch. He wasn't pretending to be anything other than what he was. Sana wanted to negotiate, Relic wanted to hide the forge. I wanted, mostly, to test a theory I'd been developing since the pistol first worked on those 3 nights, which was that unfamiliar force reads as overwhelming force to people who've never had to calculate against it before. 19 men expecting swords and farm tools were about to meet something their entire professional experience hadn't prepared them for. I had 6 working pistols by then, rank D output, each one good for 2 shots before the mandatory cooldown locked the mechanism, and 4 volunteers from the camp who'd spent 3 weeks learning to load and aim under Renic's supervision while I kept forging. It wasn't an army. It was, arithmetically, exactly enough to make 19 professional raiders reconsider their mourning. The 4 volunteers weren't soldiers before that morning, a former shepherd, a former clerk, and 2 of the original 40 who'd walked into this valley with nothing, each one trained by Relic over 3 weeks on loading, sighting, and the specific discipline of holding fire until the signal came. I'd mapped the ridge in the flanking scrub myself 2 days earlier, pacing the approach the way Brun scouts would likely pace it, counting sightlines the way I once counted tolerances on a coil housing. The math wasn't complicated. Surprise and unfamiliar force multiply each other. Numbers alone rarely do. We opened not with the ridgeline, where Brun expected resistance, but from the flanks. 2 shooters positioned in the scrub, either side of his approach, timed to fire the instant his men committed to the slope. The first volley took down 2 horses without touching a single rider. A deliberate choice, because dead mercenaries make angry mercenaries, and wounded pride makes negotiating men. The noise alone did most of the actual work. 6 near-simultaneous cracks from unfamiliar weapons, echoing off the valley walls in a way that made the number sound like 20 guns instead of 6. And Brun's men broke formation within the first 10 seconds, more startled than hurt, scrambling for cover against a threat none of their experience could categorize. Brun himself didn't run. He stood his ground on the ridge, watching 2 of his men drag a third clear of the horse he'd fallen under, doing his own arithmetic in real time, with the particular clarity of a professional recalculating an entire operation mid-collapse. When I walked out from the scrub, empty pistol in hand, cooldown timer visibly counting on nobody's face but mine, he didn't reach for his sword. "That's not magic," he said, more to himself than to me, working through it out loud. Too loud for magic, too mechanical. What in every god's name did I just watch? I told him the truth, same as I'd told Sana and Relic, because bluffing a man who's already 3/4 of the way to understanding you tends to cost more credibility than it buys. 19 men and no employer who'll pay you if you're dead, I said. I'm offering something your current arrangement can't. Amnesty for your whole outfit, a permanent stake in something that's about to matter more than one more toll run through the reach, and a weapon that makes your entire crew worth 10 times what any mercenary contract pays. Brun looked at his scattered men, at the 2 riderless horses, at the empty pistol still smoking faintly in my hand. "You're offering 19 professional killers a pension," he said slowly, "in exchange for not killing you today." When I didn't argue the framing, something shifted behind his eyes, the recalculation completing itself. "I've buried 4 men this year to contracts that paid in promises. Show me the arithmetic works past this afternoon, and I'll hear you out properly." The negotiation that followed took most of the day, conducted over the kind of bread and dried meat the camp could actually spare, and it went the way every negotiation I'd ever structured in my old life went, slowly, honestly, with both sides doing their own math instead of trusting the others. Brun wanted his men's records cleared of the warrants Ordvale had on half of them. I wanted a standing defense that didn't depend on me personally standing between the camp and every future threat. We settled it by evening, his 19 men folded into Ashfell's growing population, not as prisoners or hired swords, but as citizens with a stake. Brun himself taking on the specific, unglamorous job of securing the trade routes that would eventually matter more than any single battle. 6 of the 19 carried old warrants from 3 separate provinces, deaths and desertions mostly, nothing that troubled Sana once she'd heard the details. 2 had families waiting in a border town they couldn't safely return to, recording all 19 names and histories openly in the camp's tally, rather than pretending the past didn't exist, was Sana's condition before she'd vouch for the arrangement to the rest of the settlement. It wasn't loyalty born of belief in me. It was loyalty born of a better deal than the one he'd had that morning, which in my experience is the only kind that actually survives contact with hardship. Sana logged every new name into the camp's tally that evening by lamplight, the same careful ritual she'd performed for every arrival since the original 40, and I watched her add 19 entries in a hand that hadn't hurried once through the whole list. "A name written down is a name that counts," she told me, when I asked why she bothered with the ceremony of it. "People who've been erased once notice when somebody finally writes them back in." Rennick's assessment, once the dust settled, was blunt in the way I'd come to expect from him. "You didn't win that fight," he said, watching Brun's men help rebuild the section of windbreak their horses had trampled. "You made losing more expensive than joining. Different skill entirely. Most smiths never learn it." I told him it was the same skill, just applied to people instead of metal. He didn't fully believe me, but he stopped arguing the point. Two of the drifters who arrived that same month came specifically because a caravan hand had described, secondhand and exaggerated, a settlement where 19 raiders had been turned into citizens overnight. And I understood then that the story mattered as much as the actual event, spreading faster and further than any patrol ever could. By the time the camp's population crossed 300, refugees, Brune's former crew, and a slow trickle of drifters who'd heard the valley now had both food and a defense worth respecting. The panel updated again, quieter this time, almost businesslike. Rank C. New schematics, extended barrel assemblies, prestidigitations. Rennick looked over my shoulder at the notification and shook his head slowly. 6 months ago, he said, I was running from Ordvale's warrant with nothing but the coat on my back. Now I'm teaching a man who breaks physics for a living how to properly temper a barrel. He didn't say it like a complaint. He said it like a man taking inventory of a life that had gone somewhere he hadn't expected it to, and finding, against considerable odds, that he didn't mind the destination. Brun asked me, once the formal arrangement was settled, why I hadn't simply let his men walk away wounded and humiliated, rather than offer them a stake in something they'd arrived intending to rob. 19 trained fighters with nowhere to go make a better enemy than 19 trained fighters with somewhere to Belectron, I told him. He laughed at that, short and genuine, the first sound out of him that didn't carry an edge. Rank C brought a modest but real jump in what the panel would allow, extended barrel assemblies chief among the new schematics, and Rennick made me forge 3 practice pieces to deliberate failure before he'd trust me near the new tolerance limits at all, a habit he insisted mattered more at every rank increase than the increase itself. 300 people needed more than a working defense. They needed grain stores that didn't run thin every 3rd week, a way to trade with the handful of caravans still willing to risk the border roads, and eventually, though none of us said it out loud yet, something that looked less like a refugee camp and more like a place with a future. I didn't know yet that the woman who'd solved the first problem was already 6 days out and closing, walking toward us with a ledger under her arm and a grudge against the empire that matched mine almost exactly. Mira Hale arrived on foot with a ledger wrapped in oilcloth and nothing else worth stealing. 33 years old, sharp-eyed in the specific way of someone who's spent a career catching other people's arithmetic errors and gotten burned for finding one too many. She didn't ask for food first, which told me something. She asked who was handling Ashfell's trade accounts and laughed, short and humorless, when I told her nobody was. She'd counted the camp's grain stores before she'd finished her own meal, uninvited, and corrected Sana's running tally by 14 sacks within 20 minutes, not to show off, simply because an inaccurate number sitting uncorrected in front of her seemed to physically bother her more than hunger did. It was the fastest anyone had earned Sana's grudging respect since Brun's arithmetic on the ridge. Her story came out over that first evening's meal, the same unhurried honesty I'd learned to expect from anyone who washed up in this valley. She'd served 11 years as an imperial quartermaster in a border garrison, until a superior officer's own embezzlement got pinned on her ledger 3 weeks before an audit would have caught the actual thief. A tidy piece of legal fiction that cost her rank, freedom, and any future inside Ordvale's borders. I know exactly how this works, because I used to be the one doing it to other people before it got done to me, she said. Every settlement out here is getting strangled the same way, just slower. You're not being taxed by soldiers. You're being taxed by paperwork nobody outside the capital understands well enough to fight. I told her about the pistols, the growing camp, the 300 mouths we were already struggling to feed consistently. You don't have a food problem, she said, after I'd walked her through what caravans still bothered risking the border road. You have a tariff problem wearing a food problems coat. Ordvale taxes anything crossing the border in coin or bartered goods above a declared threshold, and every caravan master pads their prices to cover it before they even reach you. You're paying the Empire's toll without ever seeing the toll booth. She spent 2 days going through what records the camp actually had, mostly informal tallies Sana had kept in her head, and a handful of trade receipts Brun's men had picked up over the years, and produced from it a picture more precise than anything I'd assembled, with 3 centuries of engineering discipline behind me. Mira didn't do arithmetic like a hobbyist. She did it like a woman rebuilding the one skill the Empire had tried to take from her. She walked me through 3 failed attempts other settlements had apparently made at similar schemes, each one collapsing because someone had gotten greedy and tried to route obviously excessive volume through a compact meant for modest mutual aid, drawing exactly the scrutiny a quieter arrangement would have avoided. The trick isn't finding the loophole, she said. Every desperate settlement out here eventually finds the loophole. The trick is not being stupid enough to blow through it too fast. The specific trap, once she laid it out, was elegant in the way legal traps always are. Ordvale's tariff code taxed goods sold across the border at a punishing rate, but exempted goods exchanged through recognized mutual aid compacts between settlements, a carve-out originally written for allied garrisons sharing supplies, never repealed because nobody with power had ever needed to use it against the Empire's own interests. We're not a garrison, I pointed out, and nobody's recognized us as anything. Mira's smile was the first real one I'd seen from her. Recognition isn't granted, Kellen. It's registered. Ordvale's own code says any 2 settlements can file a mutual aid compact with a border magistrate, and the magistrate has 30 days to object or it's binding. Most magistrates out here haven't seen a filing in a decade. They won't even know to object. We tested the theory on the next caravan through, a modest outfit run by a trader named Corliss, who'd been paying the padded tariff on every load for 6 years and resented every coin of it. Mira drafted the compact filing herself, in the dense legal phrasing the Empire's own clerks used, and had Corliss's small trading post at the border co-sign it as the second settlement, technically satisfying the letter of a law nobody had bothered updating in a generation. The filing sat with the regional magistrate for 11 days, well within the 30-day window, and came back stamped and unopposed because the man reviewing it had a stack of 40 other documents that week, and no reason to suspect a mutual aid compact between an insignificant trading post and an unmapped settlement was anything other than exactly what it claimed to be. Mira had gambled that bureaucratic boredom would do what confrontation never could, and she'd won. Corliss's next load crossed the border with the tariff reduced to nearly nothing, and word of that arrangement moved through the caravan network faster than any of us expected, because traders talk to other traders about margins the way soldiers talk about weapons. Within 3 weeks, 2 more independent outfits had approached Asheville, wanting compacts of their own, each one another thread pulling the valley further into a trade network the Empire had never intended to exist. This isn't a loophole, Mira told me, watching the 3rd caravan unload goods at prices the camp could actually afford. It's a design flaw nobody flagged because nobody ever expected the people on this side of the border to read the law carefully enough to use it. Crane's counterpart would call it fraud. It isn't. It's just arithmetic the Empire assumed we'd never bother doing. Corliss, the border trader whose load first tested the compact, became something close to a permanent fixture in the camp's trade routine over the following months, and I noticed he'd started bringing small extras beyond the contracted goods, tools mostly, unasked and unbilled, the specific gratitude of a man who'd spent 6 years absorbing a cost nobody had ever offered to lift before. The grain reserve stabilized within a month, then began growing past subsistence for the first time since I'd arrived in the valley, and Mira folded herself into the camp's daily operation with the same brisk efficiency she must have once brought to a garrison's books, before a superior officer's greed had cost her everything she'd built. She didn't do it because she believed in me. She told me that directly, more than once. I'm doing this because every honest ledger I keep here is one more insult to the man who forged mine, she said, the closest thing to a personal confession I ever got from her in those early months. You want to call that loyalty? Call it loyalty. I call it interest, compounding daily against a debt Ordvale doesn't know it owes me yet. She kept a second, private ledger alongside the camp's official one, unasked, tracking not goods, but favors owed and given between residents. The kind of informal economy that had always existed here without anyone bothering to write it down. Debts you can see are debts you can settle fairly, she told me, when I finally noticed the second book. Debts that only live in people's memory turn into grudges eventually. I've seen it happen too many times to trust memory alone. Relic found the whole arrangement quietly amusing, watching Mira reorganize the camp's trade ledgers with the same exacting focus he brought to tempering steel. First a smith who breaks the Accord's monopoly on weapons, he said one evening. Now a quartermaster who breaks its monopoly on trade. Kresh built an empire on the idea that only he understands the rules well enough to bend them. He's about to learn how wrong that assumption was. By the time the panel next updated, Rank B, new schematics, multi-chamber mechanisms. The camp's population had crossed 600, swelled by refugees drawn as much by Mira's stabilized grain trade as by Brun's visible defense, or my growing reputation as the smith who'd embarrass 3 Ordvale knights. Growth, I was learning, came from more directions than a single forge could account for. I mentioned that thought to Mira directly, once, trying to articulate something I hadn't fully worked out yet. I keep thinking this place succeeds because of what I build, I said. It doesn't, does it? She didn't soften the answer for my benefit, which I'd already learned was not her style. It succeeds because you stop trying to do everything yourself the moment competent people showed up. That's the actual rare skill, Kellen. Most men with power never learn it. I asked Mira once, months into her running the camp's economy, whether she ever missed the garrison work she'd once done for the Empire that had destroyed her career. She thought about it longer than I expected before answering. I miss doing arithmetic that mattered to soldiers who trusted me, she said. I don't miss doing it for a system that would have discarded me the moment it found a more convenient scapegoat. This is the same skill, aimed somewhere it can't be weaponized against the person using it. 600 people, a functioning trade network, and a forge climbing toward ranks I hadn't dared imagine back in the Ordvale trial yard. None of it had come from a single breakthrough. It had come from a smith who couldn't sword fight, a mentor who'd been branded a heretic for using the wrong metal, a mercenary who did better arithmetic than his reputation suggested, and a quartermaster who'd turned her own ruin into the sharpest weapon in the whole valley. What we still lacked was a wall worth the name, and that problem was already 6 days from arriving on foot, carrying blueprints instead of a ledger. Issa Cade walked into Asheville with rolled blueprints instead of a weapon. 27 years old, dust-covered from what had clearly been a hard road, and the specific wariness of someone who'd spent her whole life around people who used walls to keep others in rather than danger out. She asked to see our defenses before she asked for food, and her expression when Brun showed her the current windbreak and timber arrangement was not encouraging. "This isn't a wall," she said. "This is a suggestion." She trained as a fortification engineer for the Imperial Corps, she explained, the kind of specialist who designed the labor camp perimeters that kept Ordvale's indentured workforce contained, until she'd recognized her own family's history in the blueprints she was drafting and walked away from a career that paid well precisely because it never asked her to think about who lived on the wrong side of her walls. "My grandmother helps build the outer ring around the ore quarries," she told me, once she'd eaten and the wariness had softened into something closer to exhaustion. Forced labor, 3 generations of it, and the Corps still uses her original schematics because they're efficient. "I've spent 6 years designing better versions of my own family's prison. I'm done." 600 people and a windbreak wasn't much of an alternative, but it was, she said, at least an honest problem. I gave her the numbers Mira and I had assembled, 600 current residents, a projected growth curve that put us past 1,000 within the season if the trade routes held, a raiding season historically worst in the 8 weeks after harvest when desperate outfits came looking for exactly the kind of unguarded settlement we'd been until Brun's arrival. Issa listened, sketched for 2 days without sleeping much, and presented something that looked nothing like a labor camp perimeter. "A wall that keeps people out works completely differently from a wall that keeps people in," she explained, spreading the drawings across the table Relic used for cooling metal. Sightlines that let defenders see everyone approaching instead of blind corners for guards to watch prisoners. Gates people can actually open from either side. Height enough to matter, not height enough to be a message. It was, in its way, the same lesson Mira had already taught me about the Empire's laws. The structure mattered less than who it was built to serve. Construction started within the week, all 600 residents rotating through labor shifts, Mira scheduled with the same precision she brought to trade ledgers, Rennick and I forging the reinforcement brackets and gate hardware between weapon orders, Brun's former crew handling the heavier stonework their raiding years had apparently prepared them for better than anyone expected. Mira's shift schedule ran on a rule she'd borrowed straight from her old quartermaster ledgers. No household worked more than 4 days in 7, no single trade skill got monopolized by one crew, and every family's ration scaled to hours logged rather than status. It wasn't generous, it was exact, and exactness turned out to matter more than generosity for 600 tired people building a wall none of them had asked to need. The stone itself came from a quarry cut 2 miles north, hauled by cart teams Brun organized into rotating 6-hour runs, and the first week cost us a wagon axle and 3 days delay before Rennick forged a reinforced replacement that outlasted every axle the camp had used before it. Small failures like that piled up constantly. None of them stopped the work. It wasn't glamorous work. It was the kind of unglamorous work that actually builds something. She argued one particular point with the stonemasons for the better part of a morning, refusing to let the southern gatehouse rise a foot taller than her original spec, even though the crew swore the extra height would look more imposing to anyone approaching. Imposing isn't the job, she said. Sightlines are the job. A wall that just looks strong is a wall built for an audience instead of for the people standing behind it. Issa's design used the terrain instead of fighting it, running the wall's northern stretch along a natural ridge that cut the required stonework nearly in half, funneling any approach from the exposed eastern flat into a single defensible gate Brune insisted on personally overseeing. I watched her argue construction angles with stonemasons twice her age and win every argument on the strength of math they couldn't refute, and recognized, with a specific kind of professional respect, someone who did for structures what I was trying to do for weapons. The population crossed 1,000 2 months into construction, refugees and drifters drawn now by 3 distinct reputations, traveling the caravan networks at once, a forge that made the impossible, a trade network that didn't bleed people dry, and a wall finally rising that promised the kind of safety unclaimed ground rarely offered. By the time the last gate hinge went in, Asheville held 1,200 residents, more people than some chartered towns inside the Empire's own borders. She and Mira clashed exactly once during construction, over whether the eastern granary should be built inside the new wall's perimeter or outside it near the transport road. A disagreement that looked petty until I understood it was really about 2 different theories of risk entirely. Mira wanted efficiency and short-haul distances. Issa wanted nothing valuable sitting anywhere an enemy could reach without first breaching the wall itself. Issa won, and within a year, neither of them ever mentioned the argument again, because the answer had simply turned out to be correct. Rennick's assessment of the wall, delivered during one of our evening forging sessions, stuck with me longer than most compliments do. Kresh's entire accord runs on the idea that only bloodline-sanctioned things deserve to exist properly, he said. Your pistol broke that for weapons. Her wall breaks it for architecture. Give it another year, and you'll have broken it for everything that matters. And there won't be an accord left standing that still makes sense to anyone. Rennick and I spent the wall's final construction weeks, alternating between gate hardware and pistol orders, and he complained more than once that a mechanism precise enough to matter needed the same unhurried attention as a proper blade. An argument I'd stopped resisting entirely by that point, because every time I rushed a piece to keep pace with construction, the finish quality proved him right. The panel updated during the wall's final week of construction. Rank A. New schematics, rotating chamber assemblies, which Rennick and I both understood immediately meant something closer to a proper revolver than the single-shot pistols that had carried us this far. 6 chambers instead of 1, a fraction of the reload time, and a cooldown that had stretched to a full 2 days at this rank, the metal itself demanding patience proportional to what it could now do. Issa found me testing the first rotating assembly against a section of scrap wall and watched with the specific fascination of an engineer recognizing a kindred discipline. You know what the actual difference is between what I do and what you do? She said. Nothing. We're both just people who got tired of building things that only served the people who already had power, and started building things that served everyone else instead. I thought about that longer than I let her see, because it cut closer to the actual shape of what Asheville had become than anything Sana or Mira or Brun had said outright. A forge that armed refugees instead of licensed nobility. A trade network that fed a settlement instead of skimming its margins. A wall that protected instead of imprisoned. None of it had been the plan when I'd walked out of that trial yard with 2 coins and a brand. All of it had become the plan anyway. The 9 original camp tools Sana had once named and tracked so carefully found permanent homes along the finished wall, mounted openly at each watch post rather than locked away. A small, deliberate gesture Issa insisted on, so every resident walking the perimeter would see the exact same battered tools that had built the first windbreak, now guarding something considerably larger than any of them had dared imagine when they first arrived. Sana called the first full council meeting the week the wall closed its final gate. 1,200 residents represented by Sana herself, Mira, Brun, Issa, Rennick, and myself, sitting around a table built from the same timber the wall had used. It wasn't a formal government, not yet. Nothing the Empire would have recognized as a settlement with any legal standing at all. It functioned like one anyway, the way a thing that works tends to outrun the paperwork describing it. We're not a refugee camp anymore, Sana said, looking around the table at the 5 of us who'd each solved a different piece of the same problem without ever being asked to. I don't know what we are instead. But whatever it is, Ordvale is going to notice it eventually, and I'd rather we decide what to call ourselves before Kresh decides it for us. Nobody around that table had an answer yet. All of us understood, without saying it, that the answer was coming whether we were ready or not. I didn't know it that evening, watching the wall's torches light up for the first time against a darkening sky, but the answer would arrive within the month in the shape of a 26-year-old prodigy with a legitimate grievance, a formal challenge, and an audience the Empire would send specifically to watch me lose. Joran Vale arrived with an honor guard of 6 and a formal writ sealed with Kresh's own signet. 26 years old, the kind of effortless composure that comes from never once having lost a trial in a life spent inside them. He was, I'd later learn, the youngest smith in Ordvale's history to reach full certification, and Kresh's chosen answer to the rumors now circulating through every caravan network about a settlement whose weapons defied the Empire's understanding of what a weapon was. The writ he carried invoked an old clause of the blade accord, rarely used because rarely needed, allowing any certified smith to formally challenge an uncertified maker's work in open contest. Winner's judgment binding on the loser's right to continue practicing the craft. Refusing it, the writ noted with the specific coldness of good legal drafting, would be treated as an admission that my work couldn't withstand honest scrutiny, and Kresh's agents would be entitled to seize it as contraband on that basis alone. "He's not here to fight you," Mira said, reading the writ twice over my shoulder with the same eye she brought to every trap the Empire had ever set for us. "He's here to make you fight him on his terms. In front of witnesses who'll carry the verdict back to every settlement watching what happens here. This isn't a duel, it's a trial with better staging." She was right. And worse, refusing outright would confirm exactly the story Kresh wanted told. His honor guard set up a formal viewing pavilion on the flat ground east of the wall. 6 banners bearing the Accord's crest, snapping in a wind that made Issa mutter about the pole footings under her breath. And I understood, watching that theater assemble itself with practiced efficiency, that Kresh's office had done this kind of public spectacle many times before. We had done it exactly 0 times, and it showed in every improvised bench the council hurriedly built for the crowd. Joran himself was almost pleasant about the whole arrangement, which unsettled me more than open hostility would have. He toured the forge Relic and I had built, examined 3 finished pistols with genuine professional curiosity, and told me plainly, over the evening meal, Ashvel's council offered him as a guest rather than an enemy, that he expected to win and didn't particularly relish it. "I've read the Accord's founding text more carefully than most arbiters bother to," he said. The bloodline clause was written to keep unstable amateur work off battlefields, back when unlicensed smiths were getting soldiers killed with faulty steel. Somewhere along the way, it became a monopoly instead of a safety standard. I know the difference. I still work for the man who's forgotten it, because refusing doesn't fix anything. Winning inside the system, sometimes, is the only lever anyone actually gives you. Brune wanted to refuse the writ outright and post armed men at the valley entrance instead, on the theory that a fight fought on our own ground beat any contest fought on Kresh's terms. Sana overruled him in council before I had to. Refusing a legal challenge in front of witnesses from every neighboring settlement tells every one of them we're only strong when nobody's watching the rules, she said. That's not the reputation this valley needs. The contest terms, as written in the challenge, specified a comparison of craft under the Accord's traditional metric, a bladed weapon, forged fresh before a panel of witnesses, judged on the standard criteria of edge integrity, balance, and lineage compliance. It was, on its face, a contest I had no chance of winning, since I still couldn't reliably forge a sword any better than the crooked blade that had gotten me branded in the first place. I spent 2 sleepless nights with Relic and Mira, picking the writ apart clause by clause, the way Mira had once picked apart the tariff code, looking for the same kind of overlooked precision that had saved us the caravan tolls. It was Relic who found it, buried in the 3rd paragraph, in language so old-fashioned most modern smiths skim straight past it without registering the actual words. "The contest shall judge the maker's craft against the purpose the work was forged to serve," he read aloud, tapping the line twice. "Not against swordcraft specifically, against purpose. Whoever wrote this clause 2 centuries ago assumed every weapon's purpose was combat by blade, because that's all that existed. They never closed the loophole because nobody ever needed to walk through it before." Mira caught the rest of it before I finished processing what Relic had found. If the writ lets either side define what purpose the work was forged to serve, and Joran already committed to comparing craft rather than category, then you're not obligated to forge a sword at all. You're obligated to forge the best possible answer to whatever purpose you name in front of the same witnesses he brought to watch you lose. The morning of the contest drew a crowd larger than Ashfel's own population. Witnesses from 3 neighboring enclaves, caravan traders who delayed their route specifically to watch, and Jorn's honor guard standing at careful attention beside a panel of 2 independent smiths brought from a border town precisely because they owed loyalty to neither Ordvale nor Ashfel. Kresh himself hadn't come. He'd sent judgment by proxy, confident enough in the outcome not to need to witness it personally. Yoren forged first, and it was, honestly, extraordinary work. A short blade completed inside the traditional 2-hour window, with an edge geometry so clean it drew a low whistle from one of the independent judges. He worked with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd never had to doubt his own hands, and when he stepped back from the anvil, the crowd's murmur made it clear most of them already considered the contest decided. I named my purpose before I lit the forge, loud enough for the whole assembled crowd and both independent judges to hear clearly, because Mira had insisted the framing needed to happen in the open before anyone could argue the terms afterward. My purpose, I said, is a mechanism that lets a farmer defend his family from raiders without 40 years of training a sword demands. Judge my craft against that. What I built over the following 2 hours wasn't elegant, the way Joran's blade was elegant. It was a rotating chamber pistol, rank A quality, every joint fitted with the precision Relic had spent a year drilling into my hands, 6 chambers loaded and cycling clean on the first test fire in front of witnesses who had genuinely never seen such a mechanism function. The crack of each shot landed in that crowd like a verdict of its own, delivered before either judge said a word. The independent judges deliberated for nearly an hour, longer than the contest itself because the writ's own language had trapped them precisely where Relic predicted it would. Both pieces represented flawless craft against their stated purpose. Neither judge could rule against a technically sound argument built from the Accord's own 2-century-old words without undermining the writ's authority entirely, and Kresh's proxy hadn't given them room to simply declare the contest invalid. We find the contest a draw on craft, the senior judge finally announced. But note for the record that the challenger's purpose serves a broader public need than the traditional standard the Accord was built to protect. We recommend the Arbiter's Office reconsider whether the Bloodline Clause still serves its founding intent. It wasn't a victory that erased the Accord. It was a crack in its foundation, witnessed by every enclave leader who traveled here specifically to see which way the Empire's own logic would bend. One of his own honor guard, a young soldier who'd said nothing throughout the entire contest, approached me quietly while Joran packed his tools and asked in a low voice whether the pistol design was something Ashfel would ever sell to independent smiths outside the Accord entirely. I told him the truth, that we hadn't decided yet, and watched him file the answer away with the particular care of a man already imagining a future his current employer wouldn't approve of. Jorn approached me afterward, not defeated so much as recalibrated, studying the pistol on the table between us with the same open curiosity he'd shown at the forge 2 days earlier. I came here to prove the Accord still meant something, he said. I think I proved the opposite instead, and I think some part of me already suspected I would. He didn't offer allegiance that day. He offered something smaller and more honest, a request to study the mechanism further, purely as a craftsman, separate from whatever report he'd owe Kresh. The 2 independent judges declined payment for their travel before departing, an unusual gesture Relic told me afterward he'd never once seen from an Accord-sanctioned official, and left instead a brief written note for the council praising the clarity of both Smith's arguments, without commenting further on which side of the Accord's future they personally favored. Relic watched him ride out with his honor guard and shook his head slowly, the way he did whenever the day's events outran his 40 years of expectations about how the Empire worked. Kresh sent his best answer, he said. And his best answer just told 200 witnesses the question itself might be wrong. That's not a man losing a duel, Kellen. That's a system losing an argument it didn't know it was having. I didn't disagree, but I noticed, watching the dust settle on the road north, that Kresh himself had learned exactly how dangerous this valley had become without ever needing to see it in person. Denholm Reyes had been in the valley since the 2nd week, one of the original 40 who'd watched me walk in with a bag of scrap iron and no papers, 39 years old, quiet in the way of men who carry something they don't discuss. I knew him mostly as a steady hand on the wall-building crews, and a fair voice in council disputes over grain allocation, the kind of unremarkable competence that makes a settlement function without ever drawing attention. What I didn't know, and wouldn't learn until much later, was that Denholm had left a son behind in Ordvale, 10-year-old Tomas, held in the specific administrative custody the Empire called a surety placement, a legal fiction dressed up as protective care, applied to the children of anyone who fled the capital under an active warrant, designed explicitly to guarantee the parents parents' continued loyalty from a distance. Denholm's warrant was 2 years old, unrelated to Asheville, unrelated to me, and entirely enough for Kresh to find once the contest with Joran made this valley worth his personal attention. The letter arrived by an unmarked courier 6 weeks after Joran's departure, addressed to Denholm alone, and I only learned of its contents because Sana noticed him disappearing from council sessions and asked me to check on him quietly rather than force the issue publicly. What I found, when he finally showed me the letter, was Kresh's method laid out with the same cold legal precision he'd used against me in the trial yard 2 lifetimes ago. The letter didn't threaten Tomas directly, because threatening a ward in state custody would have been a crime even under Ordvale's own laws, and Kresh never broke his own laws. It simply noted, in language a clerk had clearly drafted for maximum plausible deniability, that surety placements were subject to periodic review, that Denholm's continued absence and association with unlawful settlements would be noted in the boy's file, and that fathers wishing to improve outcomes for their wards retained the standing right to provide the arbiter's office with useful information. "He's not asking me to betray you outright," Denholm said, his voice flat with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been carrying this alone for 6 weeks already. "He's asking me to keep providing useful information, small pieces, nothing that looks like treason from where I'm sitting. And every time I don't, that review gets a worse note in it, and Tomas is the one who pays for my choices, not me." He showed me a small carved horse, crudely whittled, the kind of thing a father keeps because a child made it rather than because it's good. "Tomas made this the week before I left," he said. "I keep waiting to feel like I made the right choice, leaving him behind for a chance at something better. Some nights I still don't." I didn't have a tidy answer for that either, and I didn't try to invent one just to fill the silence. I sat with him a long time that evening, and I want to be honest about what I felt, because it wasn't anger at him, not yet. It was recognition of a mechanism I understood intimately from my own history with this empire. A legal structure built specifically so that nobody involved ever technically broke a rule, while every actual outcome served exactly one man's interests. Kresh hadn't threatened a child. He'd simply built a system where a father's love became the lever and called it procedure. "You should have told the council," I said, not as accusation, but because I already suspected what the silence had cost him. Denholm's answer carried more weight than anything he'd said in 6 weeks of council meetings. "And say what, exactly? That I might be the reason the next patrol finds this valley? Sana would have to choose between protecting everyone here and protecting my son, and I already know which choice she'd have to make. I couldn't make her make it." I didn't have a clean answer for him that night, and I've never pretended I did in the retelling since. What I offered instead was smaller and more honest than a solution, a promise that I'd raise it with Mira and the council as a structural problem rather than his personal failing, and a request that he tell me immediately if the pressure from Ordvale increased, rather than let it compound alone, the way it clearly already had. I ran the numbers myself before I ever brought it to Mira, the way I ran every problem in this valley, and the arithmetic offered no comfort. One father, one warrant 2 years old and unrelated to Asheville entirely, and a system on the other side of the border that had apparently learned to weaponize exactly the kind of love that made a settlement worth defending in the first place. Mira's read on the situation, once I brought it to her the next morning without naming names yet, was immediate and precise in the way her assessments always were. "This isn't a man Kresh needs to bribe with gold," she said. "Gold's easy to refuse. He's found something nobody can refuse cleanly, and he's going to keep applying it slowly enough that by the time we notice the damage, it'll already be done. That's not incompetence on our part. That's exactly the kind of leverage a legal system is built to manufacture. I've turned that decision over many times since, and I still don't know a version of it that would have satisfied every obligation at once. Protect the settlement's operational details. Protect Denholm's dignity by not forcing a public confession before he was ready. Protect Tomas by moving fast enough to matter. 2 of those 3 goals were always going to lose ground to the third, and I chose wrong about which one could safely wait. We didn't confront Denholm about it further, not directly, deciding instead, wrongly, as it would turn out, to quietly strengthen what information moved through the camp, tightening who knew the forge's exact output numbers, the wall's weaker points, the schedule of Brunn's patrol rotations, on the theory that limiting what any single leak could reveal would blunt Kresh's leverage without forcing Denholm into an impossible public confession. It was, I understand now, exactly the wrong kind of solution, an engineering fix applied to a human problem, treating the leak as a security flaw to be patched, rather than a person drowning who needed to be pulled out of the water directly. Denholm's second letter arrived 3 weeks later, and this one wasn't ambiguous about anything. Tomas's placement review had been moved up, the letter said, and preliminary findings weren't favorable. I found him alone at the unfinished eastern granary that night, staring at nothing, and the conversation we had then was the last honest one before everything after it went wrong. I keep doing the arithmetic, he told me, and the word landed harder coming from him than it ever had from Mira, because I recognized in it my own habit, borrowed and turned against me. One boy against 1,200 people. I know what the answer's supposed to be. I don't know how to live with actually choosing it. I told him what I believed then, and still believe, though it didn't reach him in time to matter. The council doesn't need you to choose between Tomas and Ashfell, I said. It needs you to trust us with the problem before Kresh finishes turning it into a choice you have to make alone. That's the whole design of what he's doing to you. Don't hand him the last piece he needs by staying silent. Denholm nodded and said he understood, and I believed him, and I was wrong about what he'd do next. I found myself, in the quieter hours that week, thinking back to the notice board in Ordvale's lower district, the list of certified smiths and their comfortable garrison contracts, and understanding for the first time just how thin the Empire's version of security actually was. A father 2 years removed from any wrongdoing, still leveraged through his own child, because Kresh's system had never needed to earn loyalty when it could simply manufacture it instead. The panel updated that same week, quietly, rank S, new schematics, rifled barrels, long-range assemblies, the cooldown stretching now to 4 full days per completed piece, the metal itself demanding a patience the whole valley's timeline no longer seemed willing to grant us. Relic noted the irony without needing to say it aloud, the forge growing more powerful in exactly the season the camp's actual vulnerabilities had nothing to do with metal at all. Relic noticed something was wrong before anyone else did, the particular perception of a man who'd spent 40 years reading tension in apprentices' hands before it ever reached their faces. He didn't push me to explain it. He simply worked longer hours beside me that week than usual, present without demanding conversation, the specific kind of company that doesn't ask for anything except not being alone with a problem. Sana called a private council session that same week, sensing the tension without yet knowing its source, and asked the 6 of us directly whether anyone had noticed anything unusual in the camp's rhythms. I said nothing about Denholm, still believing, wrongly, that I'd bought him enough time and trust to bring the problem forward himself. It was the last mistake in a long chain of small, reasonable mistakes, and within 2 weeks it would cost Ashfell more than any raid or duel had yet managed to. The nights came at dawn, 11 days after that council session, in numbers Ashfell had never faced before. A full Imperial column, 60 riders and twice that many infantry, moving with the precise coordination of an army that knew exactly where the wall's weaker gate stood and exactly when Brunn's patrol rotation left it thinnest. There was no ambiguity about what that precision meant. Someone had given Kresh the map. I learned Denholm's name as the source only after the fighting started, when Mira found him at the eastern granary with an empty satchel and the specific stillness of a man who already knew what he'd done couldn't be undone by running. He hadn't fled with the attack. He'd stayed, which told me something about the difference between a man who betrays out of malice and a man who betrays out of a father's arithmetic he never found another way to solve. Issa's warning bell rang out from the northern ridge post at first light. 3 long strikes that meant column-sized force rather than raiders, and I remember the specific silence that fell over the training yard in the seconds before Brunn started shouting positions. 600 people converting from a settlement into a defense in less time than it takes to describe. The battle itself lasted 4 hours, longer than anything the forge and the wall together had ever been tested against. Issa's fortifications holding the northern ridge exactly as designed, while the eastern gate, the one weak point the column had been aimed at with unnerving precision, buckled under a coordinated assault that Brunn's depleted rotation couldn't fully answer. Rank S rifles bought us range and accuracy the Empire's knights had never encountered. But range and accuracy don't replace numbers when the enemy already knows your gaps. Relic fought that morning too, 62 years old and steadier than men half his age, running resupply between the wall's defenders with cooled ammunition and a calm that kept at least 2 panicking new recruits from breaking formation at the worst possible moment. I found out only afterward that he'd taken a shallow cut across one forearm doing it and hadn't mentioned it once until Issa noticed the blood on his sleeve hours later. I fought that morning the way I'd fought since the first pistol against those 3 knights, aiming for horses and formations rather than men whenever the angle allowed it, because Ashfell had never been built on the idea that we'd win by matching the Empire's willingness to kill. It cost us ground we couldn't afford to give. By the time the column finally pulled back, not defeated so much as satisfied they'd made their point, Ashfell's population had fallen from 1,200 to 800. The difference split unevenly between the dead, the wounded who'd never fully recover, and families who fled east east, deeper into the reach, rather than risk a second attack. I found Denholm in the council hall that evening, not hiding, sitting exactly where the guards had left him after Mira brought him in, and the conversation we had was quieter than I expected mine to be, given everything the day had cost. Kresh offered Tomas's release, he said, before I could ask anything. Full pardon, surety lifted. The boy handed back to me the moment his knights confirmed the gate's location was accurate. I gave him the location 3 days ago. I didn't know it would be this many riders. I believe he told the truth about that last part, though it changed nothing about the 400 people we'd lost or driven out that morning. What I felt standing there wasn't the clean fury I might have expected from myself a year earlier, back when I still thought in terms the Empire's own laws would have recognized. Punishment matched to crime, betrayal answered with exile or worse. What I felt instead was recognition of exactly the trap Kresh had built and a refusal to let it claim one more casualty than it already had. You're not going to be executed, I told him, and watched something in his shoulders give way that had nothing to do with relief. You're not going to be exiled either. Ashfeld doesn't solve Kresh's kind of problem by becoming a smaller version of Kresh. The families who fled east that same week left mostly at night, quietly, without the formal farewells the camp usually gave departing residents, and Sana insisted on logging every one of their names in her tally anyway, marked as departed rather than erased. The same careful ritual she'd once used to welcome the 19 names Brunn brought in. Leaving isn't a betrayal, she told me, when I asked why she bothered. Staying past what a person can bear usually is, to themselves if nobody else. Sana, standing beside me, added the part I hadn't fully worked out yet myself. You'll answer for this. Formally, publicly, in front of the whole council and every resident who lost someone this morning. But your son didn't choose this, and neither in the end did you choose it freely. Kresh built the choice. We're not going to pretend otherwise. The council session that followed, 2 days later, once the wounded had been tended and the dead buried along the ridge Issa's wall had failed to fully protect, was the hardest hour I'd spent in either of my 2 lives. Denholm stood before the full assembly and told the truth without softening it. The letters, the pressure, the 3-week silence he'd kept even from me after I'd specifically asked him to bring it forward. Several residents who'd lost family that morning wanted exile. A smaller, angrier number wanted worse. Mira spoke last, and her argument carried the room in a way I couldn't have managed myself, precisely because she'd built her entire post-Ordvale life around understanding exactly this kind of legal trap from the inside. I was destroyed by a system that manufactured my guilt to protect someone more useful to it, she said. If Ashfell answers Denholm's betrayal by destroying him, the same way Kresh destroys people, we haven't built anything different here. We've just built a smaller empire with better weapons. The council's ruling, when it came, satisfied almost nobody completely, which Sana noted afterward was probably the honest sign of a fair verdict. Denholm would serve a full year stripped of any council voice or vote, his labor directed entirely toward rebuilding the Eastern Gate his silence had helped compromise. Publicly accountable in a way no quiet exile would have allowed. It wasn't mercy exactly. It was something closer to the kind of legitimate consequence Kresh had never once faced for anything he'd done. Tomas remained in Ordvale, the pardon Kresh had dangled, evaporating the instant his knights withdrew without capturing Ashfell outright. Proof, if any of us still needed it, that the offer had never been a genuine bargain, only another lever, discarded the moment it stopped producing useful pressure. I made a decision that evening, standing over the fresh graves along the ridge, that getting Tomas out wasn't a debt owed to Denholm specifically. It was a debt owed to the entire idea I was trying to build here, that Kresh's leverage should never again be allowed to work. Brunn took the losses harder than he let anyone see directly, blaming his own depleted patrol rotation for the gap the column had exploited. And it was Mira, of all people, who finally told him plainly that arithmetic doesn't work backward. You can't patrol against information you didn't know was compromised, she said. That's not a failure of tactics, that's just the limit of what any commander can defend against. Issa spent that week not mourning so much as redesigning, walking the compromised Eastern Gate with a fury I hadn't seen from her before, sketching reinforcements that would close the exact gap the Empire's column had exploited. A wall that can be mapped by one desperate father is a wall with a design flaw, she said, not a betrayal problem. I should have built it so no single point of knowledge could compromise the whole perimeter. That's on me as much as it's on him. Relic, forging beside me in the days after, was quieter than I'd known him to be, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't about the battle at all. 40 years in Ordvale, he said, and I never once saw the Accord punish a man the way your council just punished Denholm, accountable, understood, and still standing when it was over. Kresh doesn't build things that survive their own judgment. You just did. In the middle of the worst day this valley has had, I didn't feel like celebrating that distinction. I understood, even then, that it mattered more than the 800 people we had left could yet appreciate. Brun spent the week after the siege personally rebuilding the specific stretch of watch rotation schedule that had left the Eastern Gate thin, tearing up his own prior system entirely rather than patching it, because he told the council plainly that a patched failure was still a failure wearing a disguise. 800 residents, a wounded settlement, and a boy still held in Ordvale as proof that Kresh's methods hadn't stopped working just because they'd failed to take the valley outright. What Ashfell needed now wasn't another weapon or another wall. It needed allies who could turn a legal trap back on the Empire the way Mira had turned the Tariff Code, and the first of 3 settlements willing to hear that argument was already sending word east before the graves had properly settled. Rimwater sent word first, 3 weeks after the attack, a formal letter carried by a writer who identified their settlement as one of 1,100 souls surviving on the marshy ground 40 miles east, close enough to have heard the fighting and drawn their own conclusions about what an Imperial column meant for anyone unlucky enough to sit near it. The letter wasn't an offer of help, it was a request for one, phrased with the particular bluntness of people who'd run out of better options. Old Kettle answered next, smaller, 600 residents clustered around an actual working well that made them a target for every raiding outfit within range, and Sooth Hollow's delegation, when it finally arrived a week after the other 2, came escorted by armed riders of their own, a settlement wealthy enough to afford the kind of caution poorer neighbors couldn't, and their opening position in every early conversation carried the particular skepticism of people who'd survived this long by trusting almost no one outside their own walls. Sooth Hollow last, the largest of the 3 at 1900, governed by a council structure not unlike our own, that had apparently been watching Ashfell's rise with a mixture of hope and calculated self-interest. 3 settlements, close to 4,000 people between them, all sitting exactly as exposed as we'd been before Issa's wall and Brun's defense had changed the arithmetic. Mira saw the shape of the opportunity before I did, laying it out over the same table we'd used to plan the terrifiling months earlier. Kresh crushed us to 1/3 of our size and still didn't take the valley, she said. That tells every settlement out here exactly 2 things. That Ashfell is dangerous enough to matter, and that Ashfell alone isn't yet strong enough to guarantee it survives the next column. 4 settlements standing separately are 4 targets. 4 settlements standing together are something the Empire has to actually negotiate with. The legal framework, once again, already existed inside laws Ordvale had written for entirely different purposes and never expected anyone out here to read closely enough to use. Mira found it this time, in an older, more obscure section of Imperial Charter law than the Mutual Aid Compact that had solved our tariff problem, a clause governing frontier consolidation originally drafted to let the Empire's own border garrisons merge administratively when isolated outposts became too costly to maintain separately, never repealed because nobody had imagined settlements outside Imperial control using it against the Empire itself. If 4 settlements formally consolidate under a joint charter, Mira explained to the full gathered council, Sinan, myself, and delegates from all 3 enclaves crowded into the hall Issa had rebuilt larger than the original. The consolidated body has legal standing under Ordvale's own frontier law to negotiate directly with the Imperial Court, rather than being treated as 4 separate, unlicensed settlements the Accord can dismiss individually. It doesn't make us independent, it makes us something the Empire's own bureaucracy has to formally acknowledge exists. Rimwater's delegate, a marsh farmer named Corwin, who'd walked the 40 miles himself rather than risk the message with anyone else, wanted grain guarantees written into the charter's founding text, rather than left to informal goodwill, given that his own settlement had watched 2 prior verbal agreements with neighboring holds collapse the moment a bad season made every household selfish. Old Kettle's delegation arrived smaller, 2 elders speaking for 600 people whose entire settlement existed because of a single well, and their one non-negotiable demand was that no joint defense clause could ever require abandoning that well to defend a farther point on the map. The negotiations took 6 weeks, conducted with the same patient, unglamorous precision that had built everything else in this valley, each settlement's delegates arguing their own interests. Rimwater wanted guaranteed grain trade given their marsh-poor soil. Old Kettle wanted their well protected under the Joint Charter's defense clause. Sooth Hollow, wealthiest of the 3, wanted a genuine voice in decisions, rather than simply folding into whatever Ashfell decided. Every one of those demands got written into the final document because a consolidation built on resentment wouldn't survive its first real test. Old Kettle's two elders nearly walked out twice during the negotiations. Once over a proposed defense rotation they felt underprotected their well. Once over a trade clause they read, probably correctly, as favoring Sooth Hollow's wealthier merchants. Both times it was Relic, oddly, who talked them back to the table, not through legal argument but by reminding them plainly that he'd watched exactly this kind of prideful walkout cost his own guild everything, decades earlier, over a dispute nobody even remembered the details of anymore. I spent most of those 6 weeks doing what I'd become better at than I ever expected. Not forging, but listening, structuring compromises the way I'd once structured contracts in a life 6 centuries gone, understanding that the Alliance's actual strength wouldn't come from my rank or my rifles, but from whether 4 separate councils genuinely trusted the framework enough to defend it when Kresh inevitably tested it. Denholm, still serving his year of stripped council standing, spent those same weeks rebuilding the Eastern Gate stone by stone, present at every session as a silent, working reminder of what the Alliance existed to prevent from happening again. The Charter of the Four Reaches, as Sooth Hollow's delegate insisted on formally naming it, was ratified on a cold morning with representatives from all 4 settlements present, population now standing at roughly 4,000 across the consolidated body, once losses and new arrivals were properly tallied. Ashfell's own 800 forming the smallest, but most defended portion of a body that Ordvale's own frontier law now recognized, however reluctantly, as a legitimate administrative entity with standing to negotiate. Rimwater's delegate Corwin stayed on an extra week after the ratification, helping Issa survey how the joint defense clauses might extend to his own marsh farmland, and told me before he finally left that his settlement had buried more failed alliances than successful harvests over the years. This one might actually hold, he said, because nobody wrote it pretending the hard parts weren't hard. Kresh's response came within the month, not an army this time, but a formal notice from the Imperial Court disputing the consolidation's validity on the grounds that frontier law required at least 1 settlement to hold prior imperial recognition, a technicality his office had apparently spent weeks searching for. Mira had anticipated exactly this move, and the answer she'd already built into the Charter's founding clauses cited Rimwater's 40-year-old trading license, granted decades earlier by a since-abolished border authority and never formally revoked, satisfying the letter of the requirement Kresh's clerks had hoped nobody would find. He's not going to stop finding technicalities, Mira told the assembled council once that particular challenge collapsed. That's not a flaw in our plan. That's the whole point of the plan. Every technicality he raises and loses cost him legitimacy with his own court, because Ordvale's nobility watches how cleanly the Arbiter's office wins its arguments. A man who keeps losing legal challenges against people he calls criminals starts looking less like an arbiter and more like someone who's simply losing. Issa's fortification designs, adapted now across all 4 settlements under the Charter's shared defense provisions, closed the specific vulnerability that had cost Ashfell 400 residents months earlier, distributed watch rotations and communication relays that meant no single desperate man's knowledge could compromise more than his own settlement's perimeter again. Brune took formal command of the Joint Defense Force under the new charter, his amnestied crew now training soldiers from 3 additional settlements in tactics built around weapons the Empire still didn't fully understand. I found Denholm at the finished Eastern Gate the evening the Charter's first joint patrol rode out, the stonework finally matching Issa's original design in every particular, and told him what I'd decided months earlier but hadn't yet acted on. The Charter gives us standing to petition the Imperial Court directly, I said. Formal standing, recognized under the Empire's own law. I'm using the first petition to demand review of every surety placement tied to residents of the Four Reaches, including Tomas. He didn't thank me, not in words, but something in his posture shifted, the way it had the night I'd first told him he wouldn't be exiled. A man recognizing that a debt he'd assumed permanent might actually have an end. A year ago, he said, I thought the only way to save my son was to betray everyone who trusted me. I still don't know how to forgive myself for believing that was the only arithmetic available. I told him the honest truth, which was that Kresh had built the equation specifically so it looked that way, and that unbuilding it was the whole reason the Charter existed. I thought often that season about the difference between the empire I'd been branded worthless by and the alliance we were building instead, and the distinction kept coming back to the same simple observation. Ordvale's Accord protected one man's monopoly by design. The Charter protected 4 separate councils' right to disagree openly and still remain bound to each other, which turned out to be a far harder thing to build, and a far sturdier one once it existed. 4,000 people, 4 settlements, and a legal framework the Empire's own laws had made almost impossible to dismiss cleanly. It wasn't victory. Kresh still held the capital, the Accord, and a boy who deserved to come home. But for the first time since walking out of that trial yard with 2 coins in my palm, I stood in a hall full of people who'd chosen, collectively and with open eyes, to call what we'd built here something worth defending formally, on paper, in the Empire's own language, rather than something that only survived by staying small enough to escape notice. RANK-SSS arrived quietly. 3 weeks after the Charter's ratification, the panel's update almost anticlimactic against everything else demanding my attention that season. RANK-SS, schematics locked. Skyfall-grade components require Skyfall iron. Requisition unavailable. Nearest known deposit, Royal Vault, Ordvale. I'd suspected this sealing was coming, since Relic first mentioned the material in passing months earlier. Seeing it confirmed in the panel's flat language still landed harder than I expected. Skyfall iron, Relic explained over the forge that evening, wasn't simply rare ore. It fell, literally, in meteor strikes so infrequent that Ordvale's record showed only 4 confirmed deposits in 3 centuries, each one seized immediately by the Crown and stored under the Royal Vault's protection precisely because its properties made it the only material capable of holding a rank-SSS forging without shattering under the stress the higher ranks demanded. "There's maybe 80 pounds of it in that vault," he said. Kresh has spent his entire career making sure nobody outside the bloodline nobility ever gets close enough to ask about it. Mira's first instinct when I brought the problem to the council was the same instinct that had solved every previous obstacle Ordvale's law had thrown at us. Read the actual statute before assuming force was the only lever available. She spent 11 days buried in the trade documents Rimwater's delegation had brought as part of the charter negotiations. Old imperial ledgers nobody had properly cross-referenced in a generation, and emerged with something that made even Relic, 40 years inside this empire's legal architecture, sit up straight. "There's a resource abandonment clause," she said, spreading the relevant ledger page across the table, "buried in the same frontier consolidation law we use for the charter itself. Any material held in imperial storage without documented processing or allocation for a continuous period exceeding 100 years reverts to unclaimed status, available for legal claim by any chartered settlement able to demonstrate genuine need and formal petition." She tapped a specific entry, dated and stamped, showing the vault's Skyfall iron stock hadn't been touched, processed, or allocated in 114 years. "Kresh has been sitting on dead inventory," Relic said slowly, working through the implication, "hoarding it as a symbol of imperial monopoly rather than actually using it for anything. Because using it would mean admitting someone outside the bloodline nobility might need to handle Skyfall-grade work. The law was never written to punish that kind of hoarding. It just happens to, now that someone's finally reading it correctly." The petition Mira drafted invoked the Four Reaches Charter's newly recognized standing directly, formally requesting inspection and claim rights over the abandoned Skyfall iron stock, citing the population, defense needs, and legitimate settlement status the Empire's own frontier law had already been forced to acknowledge months earlier. It was, by design, nearly impossible for Kresh's office to reject outright without either processing the material immediately, which would take resources and time his office didn't currently have allocated, or explaining publicly why a 100-year-old abandonment law shouldn't apply to his own vault. The Imperial Court's response took 9 weeks, longer than any previous exchange, and arrived in the form of a grudging compromise rather than an outright denial. A formal inspection window, 7 days, during which a Four Reaches delegation would be permitted to enter the Royal Vault under Ordvale's own auditors, catalog the abandoned stock, and file claim on whatever portion the auditors independently confirmed met the century-old abandonment threshold. Kresh had clearly calculated that a controlled, supervised process cost him less than an open legal fight he might actually lose in front of the nobility watching. Sooth Hollow's delegate insisted on joining the inspection party personally, arguing that a wealthier settlement's presence in the room made the whole claim harder for Ordvale's court to dismiss as a border curiosity. And I'd come to trust that particular instinct enough by then not to argue the logistics of an extra traveler. I traveled to Ordvale for the inspection myself, alongside Mira and 2 delegates from Sooth Hollow, whose settlement's wealth and standing lent the claim additional legitimacy, walking back through the same capital gates that had processed my exile 2 years earlier with a formal writ instead of a brand this time. The city looked exactly as I remembered it, which surprised me more than it should have, given how completely everything on my side of the border had changed in the same span of time. Two auditors led the inspection, career clerks named Barrow and Finn, who'd clearly drawn the assignment by rotation rather than by any interest in the politics surrounding it. And their first act was reading the abandonment statute aloud in full before touching a single crate, a formality Mira had specifically hoped for because it meant the law itself, not Kresh's preferences, would frame every decision that followed. The vault itself sat beneath the Arbiter's own hall, cold stone corridors lined with cataloged weapons and materials going back generations. And the Imperial auditors assigned to our inspection were, true to Mira's read of the situation, scrupulously by the book in a way that worked entirely in our favor. 81 pounds of Skyfall iron sat in sealed crates, with processing dates stamped 114 years past, exactly as the ledger had promised, untouched, because touching it would have meant Kresh's predecessors admitting the monopoly existed to be hoarded rather than used. The auditor Barrow asked me directly, on the inspection's third day, why a settlement barely 2 years old wanted material that dangerous at all. I gave him the same answer I'd have given anyone honest enough to ask it plainly. Not for conquest, but because a settlement that couldn't defend its own borders wasn't really a settlement at all. It was just a target with better organization, and I'd already watched that lesson cost us 400 people once. Kresh appeared on the inspection's final day, not to obstruct the auditor's own findings, which even he couldn't credibly dispute once documented, but to deliver a message clearly meant for me alone. "You found every crack in laws men wrote before either of us was born," he said, watching the crates being cataloged for legal transfer. "Clever, I'll grant you that. But laws are only as strong as the willingness of people to keep respecting them once they start losing. Don't mistake a legal victory for a permanent one." I didn't answer him with a threat because Mira had specifically counseled against giving him anything he could later characterize as an admission of hostile intent, and because the honest answer was smaller and truer than any threat would have been. "I'm not trying to beat you at being an arbiter," I told him. "I'm trying to build something your accord was never designed to account for. Whether that's permanent isn't up to either of us alone anymore. It's up to how many settlements decide it's worth defending." He didn't respond to that, and I understood, watching him walk away, that the absence of a response was its own kind of answer. I walked past the trial yard one final time before leaving Ordvale with the inspection party, the platform where I'd been branded still standing exactly as I remembered it, and felt none of the particular weight I'd expected to feel. It had simply become a building, the way any place stops haunting you once you've built something that matters more than the memory of failing there. The Skyfall Iron reached Ashfell 3 weeks later under a joint escort from all 4 reaches, the largest coordinated movement the Charter had yet organized, and Rennick's hands shook slightly, for the first time since I'd known him, unpacking the crates in our forge. 40 years, he said, and I never once touched this material, because touching it without Imperial sanction was a hanging offense. Now I'm about to teach a man from another world how to work it, in a forge neither of us would have believed possible 2 years ago. Issa insisted on personally overseeing the Skyfall Iron's transport route back from Ordvale, mapping an alternate path around 2 choke points she judged too easy to ambush. And the joint escort crossed the border a full day later than originally scheduled as a result, a delay nobody begrudged her once the crates arrived intact and unremarked upon by anyone along the road. We didn't rush the first attempt, because rushing anything at this rank meant risking the only Skyfall Iron we were likely to ever legally acquire, and because Rennick's training over the past year had finally closed the gap the system's schematics alone could never fill. The panel updated once more that week, quiet and almost formal after everything it had taken to earn. RANK-SSS. Schematics unlocked. Skyfall grade forging available. 18 months from a crooked blade and a brand that called me worthless, the ceiling had finally lifted entirely. What waited on the other side of that ceiling wasn't triumph so much as responsibility, sharper and heavier than any rank had felt before it. Thousands of residents across the 4 reaches now needed proper arming before Kresh's patience with legal defeats finally ran out. A boy still sat in Ordvale custody despite a pending petition, and somewhere in the next several months, I'd need to forge something worthy of everything this valley had spent 2 years earning the right to build. The plan Rennick and I drew up for actually arming a defense worth the name split cleanly along the same lines that had built this valley from the start, and I mapped it out on the same table Issa had once used for the wall's original blueprint. 4 names beside 4 columns of responsibility that no single one of us could have covered alone. Relic and I handled production. Issa handled where every piece of that production would actually be deployed. Brun handled who'd carry it and how they'd train. Mira handled what it would cost and how the 4 reaches would pay for it without collapsing the trade network she'd spent a year building. 600 rifles we settled on. Rank A and S components mostly. The SSS grade Skyfall work reserved for something Relic and I both understood. Without discussing it directly yet, a single piece worthy of the material's rarity rather than diluted across mass production. 600 trained bodies to carry them, drawn proportionally from all 4 settlements under Brun's joint command structure. Less than a sixth of the Reach's total population, but more organized firepower than Ordvale had ever had reason to expect from unclaimed border ground. Mira's accounting made the scale of what we were attempting concrete in a way that abstract ambition never had. 600 rifles at current production speed means every forge in all 4 settlements running near capacity for 4 months straight, she said, laying out the ledger for the full council. That's 4 months of reduced grain labor, reduced construction, reduced everything else this alliance still needs to function. We're not just building a militia, we're deciding, together, that surviving Kresh's next move matters more than comfort for a season. Brun's training regimen for the 600 ran on a schedule as unforgiving as Mira's ledgers. 3 weeks of drilling before anyone touched a loaded rifle. Another 5 weeks of live-fire discipline modeled loosely on the tactics that had broken his own raid 2 years earlier. I know exactly how badly this can go wrong, he told the first cohort. I was on the other end of it. The council approved it unanimously, which surprised me less than it once would have, because I'd watched this same body absorb worse decisions with the same collective clarity over the past 2 years. What surprised me more was watching Denholm, still 11 months into his stripped year of council silence, volunteer without being asked to run the granary rationing that would keep 4,000 people fed through 4 months of reduced labor, the specific, unglamorous accounting work nobody else particularly wanted. It's not penance, he told me, the one time I asked him about it directly, hauling grain sacks alongside men half his age. Penance would be pretending this fixes what I did. This is just the actual work that needs doing, and I happen to be good at it. Whatever I am to this council after my year's up, I'd rather it be earned by work than forgiven by a vote. I didn't argue with him. I'd come to understand, watching this valley rebuild itself in 100 small ways since the siege, that he wasn't wrong about the distinction. Word of the petition regarding Tomas's surety placement finally returned in the 3rd month of production, and it wasn't the clean resolution any of us had hoped for. The imperial court, under mounting pressure from nobility, increasingly uncomfortable with how many legal fights the arbiter's office had been losing to a border settlement, ruled the placement itself technically improper. Surety custody had never been intended to apply to children whose parents' warrant predated any association with an unlicensed settlement, but stopped short of ordering Kresh's office to release him outright, remanding the matter instead to a review Kresh himself would preside over. He's going to stall, Mira predicted, reading the ruling twice. He can't defy a court order outright anymore, not with this much scrutiny on him, but he can delay a review indefinitely and call it due diligence. She was right, for 11 more weeks, until Sooth Hollow's wealthiest delegate, whose own cousin sat on the same noble council, now watching Kresh's credibility erode with every legal defeat, quietly suggested to that cousin that continued delay on a court-ordered review made the arbiter's office look less like careful governance and more like simple spite. Tomas Reyes came home on a gray afternoon in the 4th month of production, escorted not by Imperial Guard, but by a neutral magistrate whose presence made the transfer formally unimpeachable. 10 years old and thinner than any child should be, and I watched Denholm cross the training yard at a dead run the moment the escort came through the gate. 11 months of stripped council standing and stone-hauling and quiet, unasked-for penance collapsing into a single, unguarded sound I won't try to describe further than that. Mira closed the books on the 4-month production run with a single note in the margin of her final ledger page, the kind of thing she rarely bothered writing since numbers usually spoke for themselves. Cost more than we could afford, it read, worth every measured grain of it. I only saw the note because she left the ledger open on the table one evening, and I never mentioned to her that I'd read it. Donna found me watching from the granary steps and said the thing I'd been circling for months without quite landing on myself. You spent your first life building things that made war more efficient, she said. I've watched you spend this one building things that made a father's mistakes survivable instead of fatal. I don't know what that makes you exactly. I know it's not what Kresh's Accord was built to allow existing. I didn't have an answer for her that felt complete, and I've come to believe some things don't need one. The 600 rifles came together on schedule, distributed and drilled under Brun's joint command across all 4 settlements. And the final tally, when Mira closed her production ledger that season, put the 4 Reach's combined population at 5,200, swelled by 4 months of steady arrivals, drawn by news that had finally, undeniably, outrun anything Kresh's office could dismiss as border rumor. 5,200 people, 600 armed and trained, 4 settlements bound by a charter the Empire's own law had been forced to recognize. Brun's drill instructors, 5 veterans from his original 19, trained recruits from all 4 settlements using a curriculum built directly from the siege's own failures. Every lesson tied to a specific gap the Empire's column had exploited, rather than abstract theory, which Relic noted was the same principle he'd used teaching me to forge 2 years earlier. Never correct a flaw you can't first name precisely. Denholm's full year expired 3 weeks after Tomas's return, and the council vote to restore his standing passed with only 2 dissents, both from residents who'd lost family in the siege, and told him plainly they respected the earned trust without yet feeling it themselves. He accepted the outcome without argument and took his seat back at the same table where his confession had once nearly torn the whole council apart. Tomas sitting quietly beside him through the entire session, watching his father in a way that told me the boy understood more of what had happened than any of us had wanted him to carry. Issa spent that same production season quietly reinforcing every armory across all 4 settlements, distributing the 600 rifles unevenly on purpose, more concentrated at Old Cuddle's Well and Rimwater's exposed farmland than at Ashfell itself, on the theory that the Empire's next move would target whichever settlement looked weakest rather than whichever looked strongest. Relic and I began the Skyfall forging the same week, alone in the workshop after the rest of the valley had gone quiet for the night. 81 pounds of century-hoarded iron, finally meeting hands that had spent 2 years earning the right to shape it properly. "Last piece," he said, watching the metal take its first heat under a flame neither of us had ever worked with before. "Whatever you're building this for, Kellen, make it count. This material doesn't forgive a wasted attempt, and neither does everything this valley spent to put it in your hands." Issa stopped by the workshop once that week, saw the crates of Skyfall iron finally unpacked, and said nothing for a long moment before offering the same blunt honesty she'd offered the stonemasons over the gatehouse height. "Whatever that becomes," she said, "make sure it's still a tool built to defend a place, not a monument built to impress one." I told her that was exactly the distinction I was trying to hold on to. I didn't tell him yet exactly what I intended to forge, partly because I hadn't fully settled the design myself, and partly because some part of me understood that the answer needed to arrive the same way everything else in this valley had arrived, built in the open, tested against real need, rather than announced before it earned the right to matter. What I did know, watching that first heat take hold, was that Kresh's next move was coming, and that whatever came out of this forge would need to answer it completely. Kresh's final move arrived not as an army, but as a summons, delivered by the same neutral magistrate who'd escorted Tomas home, which told me, before I'd even broken the seal, that this would be fought on ground the Empire's own law now governed, rather than ground his knights could simply overrun. The Arbiter's office was formally convening a full Accord tribunal, the highest legal proceeding the Blade Accord recognized, to rule once and for all on the 4 Reach's standing and, by direct extension, on whether the charter itself would survive as a recognized entity or be dissolved by imperial decree. "He's not sending soldiers because soldiers already failed him twice," Mira said, reading the summons with the same careful attention she'd given every previous trap. "A tribunal ruling against us doesn't need an army to enforce it. It just needs every noble house in Ordvale to stop pretending the charter is legitimate, and every trade partner we've built over the past 2 years to decide we're not worth the risk anymore. This is the fight he thinks he can still win outright." I didn't disagree with her read. I understood, better than anyone else in that room, exactly how thoroughly Kresh had built his entire career around never losing a proceeding he controlled the terms of. The tribunal would convene in Ordvale itself, in the same trial yard where I'd failed 7 times and been branded an aberration, a detail I doubted Kresh had chosen by accident. 3 arbiters would preside alongside him, drawn from noble houses whose neutrality was theoretical at best, and the charter's standing would be argued not by force, but by precedent, statute, and whatever case the 4 Reaches could build in the 8 weeks the summons allowed us to prepare. Relic and I finished the Skyfall forging 4 days before we needed to leave for Ordvale, and what came out of that final heat wasn't a weapon built for the tribunal itself, so much as a demonstration of everything the past 2 years had actually proven. A single rifle, rank SS SSS, its barrel and mechanism drawn entirely from Skyfall iron and finished with a precision that owed exactly half its quality to a system panel and exactly half to 40 years of a heretic smith's patient correction. Relic held it up to the light the way he'd once held the very first crooked blade I'd made, and for once, he had nothing critical to say about the craft. "This isn't proof that your system beat the Accord," he said quietly. "It's proof the Accord's whole premise was wrong from the start. A weapon's worth was never about bloodline. It was always about who taught whose hands to do the work properly, and whether that teaching served people or just guarded a monopoly. You and I proved that answer 2 years ago. This rifle's just the clearest sentence we've written of it yet." Yoron Vale met our delegation at the Capitol gates. No honor guard this time, dressed plainly enough that I nearly missed him in the crowd. "I've spent 2 years studying your mechanism since the contest," he said without preamble, "and I've spent the last 6 months quietly advising 3 noble houses that the Accord's bloodline clause is costing Ordvale more in lost trade and lost credibility than it protects. I won't testify against Kresh directly. My family still answers to consequences he controls. But I'll testify to the craft. Honestly, if the tribunal asks a smith's opinion instead of a courtier's." Sana insisted on standing at the very front of our delegation rather than behind me, arguing the point plainly the night before. "You're the smith they'll remember," she said, "but I'm the one who can tell this tribunal what 40 starving people actually needed 2 years ago, before any of this had a name. Let them hear that first." The tribunal opened on a cold morning in the same yard where everything had started. 3 arbiters seated beside Kresh, the 4 Reaches delegation, myself, Mira, Relic, Sana, and formal representatives from all 3 allied settlements, standing where I'd once stood alone as a 7-time failure. Kresh opened the proceeding by reading the Accord's founding bloodline clause aloud in full, the same language he'd used to brand me an aberration 2 years earlier, and I understood he intended the echo deliberately, a reminder to everyone present of exactly where I'd started. Mira argued the legal case first, methodical and unhurried, walking the 3 arbiters through every statute the 4 Reaches had used to build the charter, the Mutual Aid Compact, the Frontier Consolidation Clause, the Resource Abandonment Law that had won us the Skyfall iron itself, demonstrating point by point that every gain we'd made had come from Ordvale's own laws applied exactly as written, never once broken, only read more carefully than the Empire's own clerks had bothered to read them in generations. "The Arbiter calls this an attack on the Accord," she told the tribunal. "It is not. It is the Accord, functioning exactly as its own founders wrote it, arriving at conclusions the current Arbiter simply doesn't like. If that's grounds for dissolution, then the tribunal isn't ruling on law at all. It's ruling on whether Grandmaster Kresh's personal preferences outrank the Empire's own written statutes." One of the 3 arbiters, an older woman from a minor trading house, made a note that lingered visibly on her face longer than professional neutrality should have allowed. The 2 remaining arbiters pressed Mira on details for the better part of an hour, testing whether the Mutual Aid Compact and the Frontier Consolidation Clause had ever been invoked together before, and whether that combination itself constituted a novel legal theory rather than settled precedent. She answered each question by pointing back to the original statute text rather than to her own argument, a technique Relic told me afterward he recognized from watching honest smiths defend their work under inspection. Never claim more than the material itself will support. The senior arbiter interrupted at one point to ask Mira directly whether the charter's founders had anticipated it would eventually be used to claim materials from the royal vault itself, and Mira answered without hesitation that the statute's authors clearly hadn't anticipated much of anything happening outside the capital at all, which was precisely why its language had been left broad enough to apply regardless. Kresh's rebuttal turned, as I'd expected it would, to purpose rather than law, the same ground Joran's contest had cracked 2 years earlier. "Statutes can be read correctly and still serve the wrong end," he said. "The bloodline clause exists to ensure only trained, accountable hands produce weapons capable of real harm. This man's forge has armed 600 fighters in 2 years, outside any oversight this tribunal or any noble house can verify. Legal cleverness doesn't answer the actual danger of that fact." It was, I had to admit, the strongest version of his argument I'd heard him make. Relic testified between Mira and myself, called forward specifically to address the craftsmanship question directly, and he answered it the way I imagine he'd answered every honest inspection of his 40-year career, without embellishment. "I taught this man technique for 2 years," he told the tribunal. The system gave him access. I gave him hands that wouldn't waste it. Ask any smith in this yard whether that combination sounds like heresy or simply sounds like an apprenticeship most of us would recognize. I answered that one myself because Mira had insisted from the start that this particular point needed to come from me directly, not through legal argument, but through the same plain accounting that had built this valley from 2 coins and a brand. 600 fighters, trained under a joint command structure 4 settlements agreed to jointly, defending 5,200 people who have fed themselves, built their own walls, and settled their own disputes for 2 years without a single unprovoked act against anyone outside our borders, I said. Compare that record against the Accord's own history, Arbiter. Compare how many wars your bloodline clause has funded against how many my forge has prevented. Yoren testified last, called by the tribunal itself rather than either side, and gave the answer he'd promised at the gate, honest and narrow, refusing to condemn Kresh directly while confirming under direct questioning that the Skyfall rifle before them represented craftsmanship equal to any bloodline-sanctioned weapon in the Empire's arsenal, judged purely on the metric the Accord itself had always claimed to value. It wasn't betrayal of his mentor, it was simply the truth, delivered by the one witness in that yard whose expertise nobody present could credibly dismiss. Mira spent that recess reviewing her own argument line by line one final time, unwilling to trust 3 days of silence as a sign of anything, and told me plainly she'd rather over-prepare for a hostile ruling than celebrate early and be caught flat-footed by one. I'd learned by then never to bet against her instincts about how these processes actually move. The tribunal recessed for 3 days, longer than any previous ruling in this dispute, and I spent that recess walking the same lower district streets I'd walked as a broke, branded exile 2 years earlier, close enough to trace exactly how far this valley had carried me, and far enough, still from certainty, that I couldn't yet let myself believe it was over. Relic found me there on the second evening and said the thing I suspect he'd been holding since the tribunal opened. Whatever they rule, he said, you already answered the question that actually mattered. Not in this yard, back in that valley. Over 2 years, one honest transaction and one honest lesson at a time. A tribunal can rule on paper. It can't unbuild 5,200 people who've already decided what they're willing to defend. I didn't have an answer for that, not yet, standing in the same streets that had once handed me 2 coins and told me I was worthless. I only knew the ruling would come at dawn, and that everything this valley had built would stand or bend on what 3 arbiters decided in a room none of us would be allowed to enter. The tribunal reconvened at dawn on the 3rd day, the same cold light I remembered from the morning of my 7th failed trial 2 years earlier, and I stood in that yard again with Mira, Relic, and Sana beside me instead of alone, which felt, even before a single word of the ruling was read, like the actual verdict that mattered most had already been settled somewhere the arbiters couldn't touch. Sana spoke first, exactly as she'd insisted the night before, laying out in plain terms what 40 desperate refugees had actually needed 2 years ago, and what they'd built since, with nothing but a forge, a ledger, and a wall designed to see rather than confine. I watched 2 of the 3 arbiters lean forward as she spoke, the specific attention people give testimony that doesn't sound rehearsed. The senior arbiter, the older woman from the minor trading house whose face had betrayed her during Mira's argument, read the ruling herself rather than deferring to Kresh, and I understood from that single procedural choice, before she'd finished the first sentence, that something fundamental had shifted in that recessed room. The Charter of the 4 Reaches was upheld in full, its statutory basis found sound under existing imperial law, its standing to negotiate directly with the Ordvale court formally and permanently recognized. The bloodline clause itself, the tribunal ruled, remained technically valid Accord doctrine, unwilling to overturn 2 centuries of precedent in a single proceeding, but the ruling carved an exception, with language Mira would later call more valuable than an outright repeal. Any settlement demonstrating sustained, accountable, self-governed use of non-bloodline weaponry, verified through joint command structures and formal charter, stood outside the Accord's enforcement entirely. It wasn't the end of Kresh's law. It was the end of Kresh's law having any power over us. The arbiter's office, the senior arbiter continued, and here her eyes moved deliberately to Kresh himself, is further found to have exceeded lawful authority in its surety placement practices regarding minors of settlement-affiliated parents, and in its pursuit of the prior military action against Ashfell Reach, action taken without proper tribunal sanction. The office is remanded for internal review by the full Noble Council, effective immediately. Kresh didn't move, didn't speak, and I watched 2 years of legal defeats finally arrive at their natural conclusion on his face. The particular stillness of a man watching his own authority dissolve in real time under the weight of his own written laws. He found me afterward, once the yard had mostly emptied, standing near the same platform where he'd once held my crooked blade between 2 fingers, like it might infect him. "You didn't beat me," he said, and there was no performance left in his voice, just something closer to honest reckoning. "You just kept reading laws I wrote to protect myself, and found I'd never actually protected myself as well as I believed. That's not victory. That's just better arithmetic." I thought of Mira, of every trap she'd unpicked with exactly that kind of patient, unglamorous precision, and understood he'd finally named the actual engine of everything we'd built. "You told me a weapon without a bloodline is a crime looking for an excuse," I said, and watched the words land on him with the specific weight of 2 years finally circling back to their origin. I've spent every day since proving the opposite. A weapon without a bloodline is just a weapon, same as any other, and the only real question was ever whether the hands holding it served people or served a monopoly. I think you knew that the whole time. I think it's why you needed the Accord so badly in the first place. He didn't answer that. He simply turned and walked back toward an office that would soon belong to someone else, and I let him go without needing anything further from the exchange. The Noble Council's internal review, conducted over the following month while the Four Reaches delegation traveled home, formally stripped Kresh of the Arbiter's office within 6 weeks, replaced by a rotating tribunal structure the ruling itself had effectively mandated, and the Bloodline Clause's practical enforcement collapsed within the year, as settlement after settlement across the border regions cited our precedent to secure their own recognition. I didn't celebrate his fall the way some part of me once might have. I understood, better than most, exactly how much of it he'd built himself, one legally sound cruelty at a time. Sana rang the same warning bell Issa had once installed for approaching columns. 3 long strikes. Except this time, the whole valley understood within seconds it wasn't a warning at all, just the fastest way to gather 5,000 people who'd been waiting 3 weeks to hear the same news at once. Ashfell's own council, once we'd returned home to 5,200 people who'd spent 3 anxious weeks awaiting news from Ordvale, convened not to celebrate, but to formalize what the tribunal's ruling had made undeniable. The Four Reaches, recognized now under imperial law, withstanding no noble house could dismiss, needed a name that reflected what it had actually become, rather than what it had started as. Sana proposed it, simply, watching the same assembly that had once been 40 desperate refugees behind a canvas windbreak. "We call it a kingdom," she said, "not because we need a crown, but because the word makes clear to anyone reading a map from now on that this ground answers to no one outside these walls except the people who live inside them." The vote passed without dissent. The Kingdom of the Four Reaches entered formally into Ordvale's own diplomatic registry within the season, a settlement that had begun as 40 starving refugees, now standing as a recognized power, negotiating grain treaties and border rights as an equal rather than a tolerated exception. The carved horse Dinholm had shown me 2 years earlier still sat on a shelf in their small house by the eastern gate the last time I visited, next to a newer, better one Tomas had whittled himself, proof of a specific kind of progress that no rank panel could have measured, but that mattered more than most of the ones I'd chased. Dinholm and Tomas settled into a life the past 2 years had made unrecognizable from where they'd started. The boy growing steady and unafraid in a place his father had once nearly destroyed trying to save him. Dinholm himself eventually taking on formal responsibility for the kingdom's grain reserves, the same unglamorous accounting work he'd volunteered for during the militia's production season, now permanent and fully trusted rather than penance. He never fully forgave himself, he told me once, years later. He simply decided the work mattered more than the guilt, and I understood exactly what he meant by that. Mira's name was formally cleared of the old embezzlement charge that had exiled her from Ordvale in the first place, a small administrative correction buried in the same Noble Council review that stripped Kresh's office, and she read the notice once, filed it without ceremony, and went back to the kingdom's trade ledgers the next morning as if nothing about it had changed anything essential. It hadn't really. She'd already built the life that mattered years before the paperwork caught up to confirm it. Issa's fortification designs became the standard taught across every settlement in the growing network of allied border enclaves. Walls built now, everywhere, to see rather than to confine. And she took on students of her own eventually, teaching the same lesson she'd once explained to me in a single, unguarded evening, that the discipline mattered less than who you built it to serve. Brun's amnestied crew grew into a proper standing defense force, respected rather than feared, and he never did learn to enjoy peacetime paperwork, though he tolerated it with the same grudging competence he brought to everything else. He kept the very first crooked blade I ever forged displayed above his own workbench, warp, tang and all, not as a trophy, but as a teaching piece, and told every new apprentice the same thing he'd once told me. A flaw named honestly is a flaw halfway repaired, and no schematic in any system will ever do that naming for you. Relic stayed at the forge until the day he died. Years later, having trained a dozen apprentices in techniques the old Accord would have called heresy, and the kingdom simply called craft. And I think of him every time I light a fire. The man who taught a stranded engineer from another world that a schematic and a skill were never the same thing, and that the gap between them was the only honest measure of what a person actually deserved to be trusted with. Joran Vale visited more often than either of us expected in those first years. No longer bound to a creche, who no longer held any office worth serving, working alongside Relic and me on projects that blurred further every season between bladed craft and mechanism. Proof that the divide the Accord had spent 2 centuries defending had never been as fixed as it claimed. I think about him sometimes as the version of Creche's system that might have existed all along, if the system had ever actually valued craft over control. Sana never took an official title beyond the honorary council seat the kingdom voted her, but every new arrival still gets pointed to her first, the way I was pointed to her on that first afternoon with 2 coins in my pocket and no idea what I'd stumbled into. She still asks the same question she asked me: can you make something that keeps my people alive through the next storm season? I still hold RANK-SSS, though I've long since stopped thinking of the panel as anything but a quiet, useful tool rather than the whole story of who I've become. The rank measured what I could build. It never measured what any of it was for, and I learned that lesson slower than I should have, given how many people had to teach it to me directly before it finally landed the way Relic's hammer corrections once did, one patient repetition at a time. People ask me sometimes, traders mostly, passing through on the road, Issa's gate was built to welcome rather than guard, whether I ever regret the 7 failed trials that started all of this. I tell them the honest answer, which is that failing at swordwork was the only reason I ever discovered what I was actually good at, and that most of the worthwhile things I've built since came from being told plainly that I didn't fit somewhere and choosing to build somewhere else instead. I stood at the wall's northern ridge not long ago, watching a new caravan cross into the kingdom under the same gate Issa first designed to see rather than to imprison, and thought about a version of myself 2 years younger, holding 2 copper coins in a rented room, reading a status panel he didn't yet trust was real. That man built an engine once, in a world that no longer exists, that made older weapons obsolete. I like to think this is the better use of the same stubborn instinct. A kingdom built not on what a weapon could destroy, but on what a fair trade, a taught skill, and an honest ledger could hold together instead.
That's the whole arithmetic, start to finish. 2 coins, a system that never handed me a shortcut, and a valley full of people who taught me the parts no rank could. If you liked watching a monopoly lose to better bookkeeping and a mentor's patient hands, you already know what kind of stories this channel tells. Subscribe, drop a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. New recap every week, and tell me in the comments, which law would you have read first?